Try now. Hello, can people hear me? Yes. Well done, Tracy. Thank you. So I'm now going to invite, I think, Sonia Khan and Adrian McDowell to speak to this item. You've got up to 10 minutes. Oh, sorry.
Thank you, Chair. Can you hear me? Okay. So I'm going to speak to the presentation which was shared in the papers, and I won't talk through all the slides, so I'll signpost to where we are in the presentation. But just to set the scene, as you say, Chair, this has been a commitment. It's also been a political commitment in the 2018 mayoral manifesto, sorry, the Council Labour Party manifesto. So that's about tackling poverty, including child poverty, and it's linked to wider commitments about tackling key inequalities. And so starting early before the pandemic, we started to look at what we could do to proactively meet the commitment to tackle poverty. What we didn't want to do was something that was short-term or knee-jerk and looked at just, for example, financial help for those in poverty now. We wanted to take a step back and look at what was driving poverty currently in Hackney and in London, and make sure that we were adopting commitments that led to actions that looked in a rounded way at poverty reduction. So there's a timeline provided in slide 3 because there was clearly the pandemic, which really exacerbated people's financial circumstances. Those who are in poverty were more impacted, indirectly and directly. Understood. Tracy, are you able to move the slide? If you could go to the slide before, please. Okay. Yeah, thank you. So, so the timeline is provided because clearly we needed to take account of the pandemic, but we wanted to share with you the work that was going on prior to the pandemic, so running up to March 2020. And really what we were doing at the time was mapping and gapping what was going on in the council and also in partnership. And it was very clear from that there was a need to actually bring greater coordination and a greater focus around poverty reduction in all of the work that was being done by the council. So rather than layer on something on top of that was a poverty reduction programme or something linked to additional actions and finances, actually the mapping and gapping showed that there was a lot to do to develop the organisation's capacity and readiness to support people who are in poverty. Then the pandemic hit, and actually we were able to use the immediate support that needed to be put in place to look at how we could develop the longer term response to poverty reduction, to poverty and to poverty reduction. And I came here and reported last March on how we were able to do that through working with partners through the food poverty response, but then how we broadened that out to work with community partners and start to look at the more preventative ways that immediate help could be developed further with referrals to advice providers and to others. And also the other key point that came up there was that it need to make sure that our response to poverty was really taking on board those who were at greatest risk based on equality groups, and make sure that there were partnerships in place and responses in place that worked with those who were from diverse communities. And one of the things we found quickly was that there was less connection between the council and the organisations that were on the ground with the good reach. And so during the pandemic, that development of the Community Partnerships Network really helped with that. So then from September 2020, this started to be used to develop a poverty reduction framework as a working framework to help us to both respond to the pandemic but do so in a way that put in place the developmental work that was needed to mean that there was support in place beyond the pandemic. And I'll talk about that. That's very much informed the poverty reduction framework. So in other words, that idea of building back better, how do we deliver support during the pandemic that keeps in mind the longer term support that we need to put in place? And then over the last year, there was a further development of the poverty reduction framework, particularly working with partners and also working extensively across the organisation with those frontline services that I mentioned could actually be much better coordinated and focused on poverty reduction. And so there was a poverty reduction network set up internally within the council to bring together the different activities. And that has helped us to work across the services in the council to develop the poverty reduction network framework so that it's real. It's not something that's been theoretically drafted at a desk. It's actually informed by all of the different issues that services face currently supporting residents in poverty. So if we can go on to the next slide, please. Sorry, the next one, what we mean by poverty. Yeah, so that one. So just to be clear that, as you say, Chair, there's no formal statutory requirement to measure poverty at the moment and for us to report on poverty or child poverty. But there are a lot of measures, and the poverty reduction framework will consider all of the measures in detail and consider the ones that are most useful. But broadly, we have taken a definition that is about resources that are unable to meet people's minimum needs, and that includes people's ability to participate in civic life and so beyond the basic material needs. So I'm now going to skip through the next set of slides because I'm conscious of time. We wanted to share those in the deck because they set out the data in Hackney, so the profile of poverty and also the causes of poverty on slide 10. And it's important to highlight that in terms of the causes of poverty, on slides 9 and 10, there's both the causes of poverty that are linked to where there may be groups who are most at risk of poverty, but there's also market forces. There's also what is going on in the world of work, in housing costs and in childcare that means that people's household budgets are so much more stretched. So then if I move on to slide 11, which is the poverty reduction framework. This is then what I wanted to come here and share with you, which brings you up to date with where we've got to with developing a poverty reduction framework. The framework itself is going to Cabinet in March. And so we are too close to bringing something, a full draft, and putting that in the public domain in advance of it going to Cabinet. But we are sharing with you all of the strands of the framework so that actually before we finalise the framework, we've got a chance to get your challenge and your questions and the opportunity to feed those in. And Adrian is working on the final drafts of the framework, so can take those on board. So the framework covers ways of working. So this goes back to what I was saying about actually needing to be more, have poverty aware approaches and for people to be aware of what's needed to work with residents in poverty. So we've pulled that out as a first priority. It very much builds on the work that Ian and I brought to the audit committee that was reflected in the report that was published in January about what we've learned from the pandemic and the need to really draw together our understanding of resident needs, recognising the value of place-based working to reach residents, and also critically the need for frontline staff to be supported to be able to meet not just the presenting need, but the underlying needs. And I'm not suggesting that's easy work, but in the full poverty reduction framework, we'll share what we've done, we'll share what we've evaluated, and we'll also say what we're going to do next. And then linked to that, how we make sure that we've got a workforce that across the range are aware of the impacts of poverty and of what somebody who is in financial need might be presenting with that might not obviously, you know, they might not be saying I'm struggling with my budgets, but they may well be. The second strand is about prevention, early years and early help. So critical in this is to weave in the early years work, which is led by Children's, and also the early help and early intervention, which is led by Children's. And don't need me to tell you the critical link between early intervention and what can be done in early years and the impact that that can have on people's life chances and specifically on their economic well-being. The second strand of that is about making sure that there's early help for all ages, so identifying risk and acting early. And this particularly draws on the work that has been led by services like Benefits and Housing Needs, where they've looked at how they can take a step back and support people who are facing complex needs and otherwise getting into an endless cycle of being at risk of homelessness because their underlying needs aren't being met. The third area is about responding to the material impacts of poverty. So that's been about looking at how we can better coordinate emergency support, maximise income and debt support. It brings in the work that we've been doing for a number of years, which we've reported here before, about the advice sector and how we can work with the advice sector to make sure that, again, they're taking a holistic approach. They're not just working with people's presenting needs. We're not just measuring appointments, but we're measuring customer journey. And it also builds in and looks at how we sustain the partnership work that's been developed through the pandemic. And so using some of the budget from the 2020, 21, 22 that was put towards poverty reduction, we've been able to keep in place people who've been working with partners to continue to develop that partnership approach. The fourth area is about responding to the cost of living and low wages. So that's more about us influencing wider work led by housing strategy and led by employment and skills. But in the slide deck, there's the detail about what we're asking specifically those areas to focus on to make sure that they're focused, that they've got a way of working that is going to tackle poverty. So, for example, the focus on employment and skills is about not just making sure that the services are reaching people who are in poverty, but they're able to offer something rounded to people. So making sure that there is the financial help or the help with clothing that people need to be able to get to job interview. And then the final area is about the links to strategic areas. Again, noting that within early help and early years, there's a key link to tackling child poverty. And also within the health and wellbeing strategy, which is up for consultation at the moment, there's a link to financial inclusion. So noting where we've already been able to situate a focus on poverty reduction. Chair, I could go through the rest of this presentation, but I'm concerned about time. And I wanted to just introduce the poverty reduction framework, the elements itself. It might make more sense for me to pick up on those as we go through questions.
Absolutely fine. I just wanted to see whether any of the cabinet members that are present here want to come in. If it is, it will be very, very brief. Is there anybody who? Councillor Kennedy.
Really quick reminder, building on what Sonia's just said about advice, that when Cabinet approved the current year's grants programme, we've increased our spend to advice grants providers from $750,000 to $1 million. That was approved by Cabinet, recognising the vast increase in demand that those advice partners have seen, especially in the last 2 years.
Thank you. Did any of the other cabinet members want to say something very brief, or should we move on? Yeah. Councillor Williams.
I was wondering if Councillor Maudley might want to say something before she leaves, before I speak, but if not, all I wanted to really stress was that the underlying demands on services will undoubtedly increase because of the settlement, the small steps that have been made in the settlement that we've just seen, and the Mayor and the Cabinet Lead for Finance have written to the Secretary of State for Levelling Up to say just that. And the only other point that I want to make is that we know that poverty affects everyone. and it does push up public spending. So this piece of work is incredibly key for going forward. We have to have these provisions, and officers have worked incredibly hard. I did say that was the last point, but actually this is so important, and it is cross-cutting, and that is why there are 4 cabinet lead members who are overseeing this piece of work. There isn't any departments that it won't touch. And so the next term is going to be really quite key for us to work very closely with one another.
I
Thank you, Councillor Williams. I've now opened the floodgates. Councillor Chapman, or did Councillor Woodley want to come in first?
I will come in briefly, as Councillor Williams has sort of invited me to do so. Really just to say that there is that crossover with early years into the really vital family strengthening work that we do through our children's centres, and the kind of the wider reach we have through our adventure playgrounds. We've been really successful, I think, at reaching the communities that really needed support through those hubs and centres, particularly with our food vouchers and just that general sense of a safe place to be and to go. So I think there's not that sort of stop at age 5, 0 to 5, and that through the early years strategy we're looking to sort of build upon that wider family support. And yeah, I apologise that I can't stay for the whole meeting, but I just thought it'd be worth throwing that in.
Thank you. Councillor Chapman, really briefly.
Yeah, yes, basically what I just wanted to stress really is the huge scale of the problem we have in Hackney in this space. I mean, 35,000, as you see in the slide deck, 35,000 cases in need on universal credit. And while we're never going to be able to solve the problem just a council on our own, it's a really, really important initiative. And I could just commend the work of Sonia and the team, which I think is a fantastic contribution towards it.
Thank you very much. You've actually picked up on some of the points I was proposing to sort of briefly make. I mean, thank you very much for bringing the poverty strategy, still to scrutiny panel, still at a stage where, as we understand it, we can feed into it. And I think we're very keen to do so. We do sort of recognise the the essential and cross-cutting nature of this work. And I mean, I'm also hoping that, and I'm sure this is the case, that this is a reasonably sort of living strategy. So it's going to be developed, I think. I think this is something that we're going to want to feed into both from Scrutiny Panel and also across our commissions as well, because I don't think there's any area of scrutiny where this doesn't impact. I mean, actually, it's very briefly, there's some actually quite staggering figures about the numbers of our fellow residents who are impacted by poverty. 36% of households in Hackney are in poverty after their housing costs. Almost half of our children are living in poverty. 2 in 5 older people are in income deprivation, and poverty has far more impact on households of people with disabilities. So this is a really, incredibly significant piece of work, and it's obviously something that we can't solve as local government on its own, but I really do welcome the ambition of trying to make an impact on improving this in Hackney. But I mean, I think this is something that we're very, very keen, I think, really to work with across the scrutiny commissions and the scrutiny panel to really try and, so I think the any questions that we have this evening will be entirely in that spirit to try and make this strategy work. So having said that, I think I'm just going to sort of pick Councillor Billington and then Councillor Sharman to ask the first questions, and then I think Councillor Patrick and Councillor Conway also had questions, and then we'll have a third round after that. So first 2 from Councillor Billington and Sharman. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Is this the first poverty reduction strategy the council has had?
I think we're going to take your question.
Yeah, I know. I just want to know yes or no to that, and then I can.
Sonia, yeah. No, sorry, it's me.
Yes, it is the first. And just to be clear, it's not a strategy deliberately, it is a framework for the very reason that you say that we want it to be adaptive and responsive. So we want these to be the broad priorities, but we want the opportunity to be able to flex the actions depending on the scale of need and where we want to put our focus. But yeah, it's the first it's the first plan that's been adopted, certainly for the last. There was a child poverty plan up until 2014.
I'm just interested in that because it struck me that, bearing in mind the levels of inequality in this borough, it seemed odd that this would be the first one we'd ever had. So it's interesting to put it in the context of the child poverty one before. What assessment have you made as to the impact of the actions in the framework? How will you know that you're having any impact?
I think I'm going to bring Councillor Sharman in and then give Sonia a chance to answer your questions together. Thank you.
Thanks, Chair. Just to say, I mean, first of all, very much welcome the idea of priorities in this. Poverty is such a structural problem for society that, and we are a comparatively minor actor. So I think it's great this strategy begins to specify areas that we can be most effective. I suppose the question I've got is why you've chosen those particular three, how they link up, and then to say that clearly this is a beginning of a framework from a kind of audit position. And just building on what Polly's just said, I think we need to see each of these activities, the resource commitment to each of these activities with the outcomes, so that we can then judge whether the underlying model that you're assuming, in other words, you're assuming that by doing things in these three areas, we will make a measurable impact on poverty in Hackney. So finding a framework in which we can both have a resource allocation matched against achievement, I think will be a necessary next step on this. The other issue I just wanted to raise, and it's less, I guess, addressed to you, Sonia, is to the issue that a number of cabinet members already made, which is this is a major change in the way we've done things. And I very much welcome the idea of changing the ways we work. You did a great presentation to the audit committee, as you say. It's a very demanding one because it means changing the front line of our council services. That is a big job. And I guess the question I've got, as much to Chief Executive and to the Mayor, is how we're going to lead this as a priority among a lot of competing priorities to make sure we genuinely join up the elements here. And that's represented both on the management team and in the executive, that coordinated leadership from the top. Because in my view, unless you have that, this very ambitious programme won't be effective.
Thanks, Sonia. So if you could just deal with both those really significant questions together, thank you.
Thanks, Chair. If it's okay, I'll take Councillor Sharman's question about why we've chosen those priorities first, because Councillor Billington's question about impact flows. So the reason that we've chosen those priorities is because, first of all, we wanted to make sure that we were able to respond to the immediate material impacts for somebody who's in poverty now, as well as being able to look at the longer term work that's required to be better prepared as a borough to respond to poverty. So why did we want to focus on the immediate impacts? Because you can't get a job, you can't go to school and access the education system if you're hungry or you're struggling. And there's evidence about that in terms of the benefit reductions and how they've impacted people's employability. Now, I appreciate the scale of the challenge means that we can't match the gap, clearly. You know, what's driving poverty for people who are in poverty now is a lot of market forces, housing costs, as I say, and low wages. So we can't match that, but we can at least make sure that the support that is available is as joined up and coordinated as possible. And you recall when I came to speak about the food poverty work last year, and some of you will also recall the food poverty action plan that we just adopted going into the pandemic, one of the things we found was that there was a disconnect between the work going on the ground to support people, the advice providers, and the sort of emergency support that the council could offer. So actually, it was fragmented. And during the pandemic, we've tried hard to join that up, but it seems there's an argument for that continuing to be a clear focus, so that we can do what we can to at least corral resources, join them up for those who, as I say, can't wait for a shift that might come if we can encourage employers, as we are, to be better employers. So that's the reason there's the focus on the material impacts of poverty. And I think that when I look at going into pre-pandemic, when we looked at the existing strategies that other councils have adopted, I would say that they either focused on those immediate needs or they focused on the long-term preventative structural issues. And actually, looking at that, I would say that we needed to do both, and that was the assessment that we made. So why have the longer-term focus? Because we need to make sure that the work that is going on across the council and in partners to look at housing and respond to the housing crisis, and to look at employment and the work with employment, we need to make sure that is focused on people who are in poverty. We need to make sure that those strategies and plans ask those questions. So again, that's the reason for that focus. Early years and early help, there's a very, very clear evidence base. It was built into the child poverty work, and we don't want to lose that understanding that you can make the biggest difference in early years and in early help, and not necessarily just in poverty-related actions. You can make a big difference by supporting parents to talk to children, and that, you can show how that can impact outcomes later in life that are economic. And then the area that's about ways of working, I think, is the game changer that we've developed through the pandemic. So I think that has very much been the understanding that there is an opportunity to support frontline workers better, whoever they are, wherever they are, whether they're in the council or in partners, both enabling them to better understand what support is available across different partners, but also in the way that they relate to people. And it's not new. It builds on work that was being done before in terms of how you can make sure that people are being offered good help, like help that actually moves people on rather than just a handout. But it seemed to be a clear opportunity to make sure that that was better embedded into the work of the council. And when you see the full poverty reduction framework, you will see that we've assessed what's worked so far and what we want to do more of. So that's response to the question about how they link up. About why those three, and hopefully how they link up, how that one is about meeting the immediate needs, and the other is about the longer term structural drivers of poverty, but then actually the ways of working is a way of being able to make sure that we're getting the most out of the interactions that we do have with residents. In terms of the resource commitment that's attached to that, the poverty reduction framework will have a lot more detail, but it is deliberately a framework, and we've said that we would adopt an action plan that would flex. I think that enables us to bring in the questions that you've got and enable corporate leadership, so chief exec and may want to come in, to actually identify where we might want to put an emphasis resource-wise. So this is what the evidence is telling us we need as a framework. And then we've started the conversation using this framework to say, well, where would we put our emphasis? Because that very much is about a whole corporate plan that is orientated towards tackling poverty. So actually, there's no point having something that sits on top of our overall corporate strategy. So the framework gives us the overarching areas that we want, but actually where the resources are put is something that needs to be linked more to overall corporate strategy and where we might decide to put our resources depending on the immediate needs. I'll bring Adrian in to talk about the impact, because Adrian's done a lot of work on that. But I mean, clearly, when you're talking about a lot of external drivers, you need to be careful about claiming that you are going to reduce poverty by this amount. And so we've put in those metrics that we want to follow and see where we're going, but we've also included an account of what success would look like and what's more measurable that we can see where we're making a difference. Adrian?
Okay, thank you. So on the, okay, can you hear me? Yeah. So on the measurements point specifically in terms of what success would look like and what we're aiming for in terms of poverty reduction, I think it's the final slide in the presentation or towards the end. We've taken a like three style approach to this, which is similar to what the Scottish government have done as well. So the first one looks at what those direct measures of poverty are, which really that 60% of median income and what that means. I think that's quite self-evident in terms of measuring as closely as we can what poverty is and that standard international measure. I will say that at a local level, some of that information is quite delayed in getting through. It's better at regional. At local authority level, it's more difficult, but there's some direct measures there. The second point is the wider point around the contextual measures of understanding what's causing poverty as well as its effects. And this is related to inclusive economy, but I think there's room to supplement some of these measures. So that would be things like universal credit claims, employment rate, free school meals, things like that, really trying to understand contextually what these kind of proxy measures are and how it's impacting people. Because like I say, those direct measures of poverty are more limited, so kind of understanding what's going on more. And then the third point is around the outcomes of what we're trying to do, connected to the framework. And as Sonia said, the framework will have a 12-month action plan connected to it. And so those outcomes are based on the areas of the framework as it is now. And so really trying to make the connection between what we do as a council, as well as in partnership with these wider outcomes. So for example, that might be around residents being better supported to maximise that income. So that might be the outcome, and then we'll have some actions related to that to try and achieve this overall aim, which I think has been quite clearly demonstrated is very significant, and obviously coming to the panel tonight at the start of the year, which is obviously going to be particularly difficult, is quite timely, but also potentially a bit overwhelming. So trying to connect what we do with these wider outcomes to achieve poverty reduction overall. So those are the measures specifically. I think the question might have also been wanting to ask what's going to make the difference in terms of the interventions and the programs and things that you do. I think as ever, we try and learn about what works, and there is some good evidence out there, particularly in child poverty and what matters most in terms of support for parents, and employment always comes much higher than other things like debt, which might surprise some people. So I think being grounded in our actions about what the evidence shows can make a difference will be very important in developing the action plan. But it is very broad area. For example, there's crisis support, which obviously tries to address a particular crisis situation. And then you might want to, we would want to complement that with something wider scale, like income maximisation. As Councillor Chapman said, the scale of this is massive, with 35,000 people on UC. So it'll be a combination of things which will be evidence-based and try and make the impact in residents' lives, be that immediate if someone's in crisis, or more generalised about income maximisation.
Thank you very much. Very exceptionally, I think I'm going to allow Councillor Billington, ask Councillor Bingham if she's got any follow-up questions, and then we're going to have to move on to the next round of questions. I know that other members have got important questions to ask as well. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, thanks very much for that. I suppose I felt like I needed the presentation to start at the last slide and see the ones that follow it, which you started to articulate. But understanding the how you will use those measures, because those measures are not specific on that slide, they are sort of general top level ones. And I think an acknowledgement of those wider drivers is important, partly in terms of resource allocation. How much resources should we give to this in order for us to be able to effectively assess impact? We know that the crisis measures may well be very big in terms of cash transfers, but not necessarily as effective at the long-term diversion out of poverty. The preventative work may well look like it's much harder sometimes to see the impacts quickly, but have longer strategic. That's the thinking that I would like to see. And certainly if I was in Cabinet, I would want to see that before I signed this off.
I don't think that that needs a substantive response because it was just a really helpful comment. I mean, I think, as I said at the beginning, we're going to be coming back to this, I think, as scrutiny, both on panel and across our commissions. So I'm going to take another round of questions from Councillor Patrick and Councillor Conway, and then final round from Councillor Snell and Councillor Hayhurst, and then we're going to have to finish this item.
Thanks. Following on from the last point of Councillor Billington, I've got some other points about the resources. It's not only the financial resources that we're going to have to put into it in a cash-strapped council. You know, the money we have got as a local authority is cash-strapped. We are. I can't foresee us having an increase in our budgets over the next few years, precisely, more a major decrease. So this will cost money to implement. I just wonder where the money is going to come from to implement it, and how we're going to get all staff on board, because I work for another local authority and we work very much in silos, and this is going to need a cross council, if not a cross partnership, working. And I just wonder how you're going to bring your partners on, presumably people like the NHS, schools, who are going to have to work with us to make sure this is implemented, and also people who don't actually come across any of our services. And I'm sure there's lots of people out there who are struggling, but don't necessarily integrate with services. Maybe many older people who perhaps get their benefits and manage on their benefits, but don't necessarily, perhaps because they don't need care. There's no interface with any services. So I am worried about those people as well. As I said, there's no metrics in it. So if you come back to this in a year's time, or 5 years, or 10 years, or 20 years, how am I going to measure this? And how will I know there's been improvements? I know some of this is very long term, starting with child poverty and education, but we can enhance people's education. But if they're not going to be able to afford to live in the borough, because either there's no social housing, or the cost of private housing is so expensive, you have to have a very good job to be able to afford to live in the borough. So we also need to work on things like employment, not only getting people jobs, but getting people well-paid jobs so that they can afford to carry on living here, because lots of people have to leave the borough because they can't afford to live here. So it's about not only a job, it's about a well-paid job. So we need to bring in jobs into the borough, well-paid jobs. And also on housing, I think this feeds into the council's wider housing strategy. We know there's not enough social housing to go around. Private housing at the moment is extremely expensive. Is there something that we can do as a council across the market across Hackney, or perhaps with other boroughs in partnership, because I'm sure Hackney is not in isolation in poverty, to improve the housing market, the intermediate housing market perhaps, where people can afford to live in inner London and work. So they're my points. Sorry, it's a bit of a rant.
Thanks very much, Councillor Patrick. I know that was a lot of points. I'm afraid because we've run out of time, I'm going to bring in another councillor, Councillor Conway, because I think you wanted to ask a question.
Thank you. I have quite a specific one actually, and it's to do with when we're talking about prevention and early help, quite specifically. I think that there's a tendency for us to just think that we understand the main drivers of poverty, and I think that there are many hidden drivers of poverty that are in our control as a local authority, and I'm wanting to know what work we're doing to, or what will be included in this framework and strategy to identify what work we'll be doing to identify those risks. And what comes to mind for me is last week, Councillor Gordon, Councillor Patrick, Councillor Adajare and I met with some young people, care experience young people from Hackney. So these are over 18s. And we were hearing from these young people, which leads on to also another item that we have coming up about our overall financial position. These are young people who've spent a long period of time in supported accommodation that we know we're spending a hell of a lot of money as a local authority on. And so many of those young people were telling us that they cannot get into employment or training, because if they do, they'll have to pay their rent for that supported accommodation. They won't be able to afford it. So there are services that we're commissioning for young people, albeit a relatively small number of residents within the borough, that are actively dissuading them from being able to upskill themselves and get into employment. We've then got people who then get into their early 20s before they're starting to go into education and employment. So I think I would just like to know, what are we doing to really be able to understand whether there are any structural inequalities that are happening on a micro scale in terms of the council, as opposed to the sort of macro level challenges that we're all aware of in terms of the broader sort of housing challenges and cost of living. Thank you.
Thanks, Sonia. Do you want to take those? I mean, obviously, it's a wide-ranging set of questions. I think Councillor Patrick is basically looking into the future, really about sort of long-term evaluation, particularly about the housing market, and Councillor Conway is obviously about unlocking barriers within the council, I think. So.
Thank you. With regards to the first question about resources, the idea is, as I was saying, not to layer something over the top that is a poverty reduction programme. So the idea is that this framework is embedded within the work of the council and is linked to our corporate plan. So I am not making the case for, within the framework, an additional budget. It's about actually how we orientate our priorities towards tackling poverty. So that's the first point. In terms of how we engage partners and frontline workers across a diverse system, as you say, NHS and council services, voluntary and community sector, that work has already been going on. So as part of developing our response to the pandemic, through the work of the Community Partnerships Network, there's been a lot of work to develop the resources that frontline workers need to be able to identify the type of support that they can offer, but also to work with frontline workers on the type of issues that come up and how they might be able to work more holistically and relationally, and what the barriers are. And so there's been cross-sector sessions, workshops with people to look at that, and then to look at what that means for continued support. And then the third area has been to provide people with support as frontline workers. So recognising when you move into this space of really trying to understand the underlying issues, it has an impact on you. Sometimes you can't help people fully. There's the risk that people take home trauma, you know, what's visceral trauma as well from that. So there's been a lot of work to develop that. There's been an evaluation specifically of what's been done with 100 people. That's not all of the people who've been involved, but it's looking at that sample, so that we're then able to actually understand what is working well. So I just wanted to assure you that that's not theoretical. I appreciate how hard it is, which is why it's drawing on what's been done already, particularly led by the tech change support team in IT and by colleagues in my service, but working closely with partners. And there was a big session that brought together people from different parts of the NHS, voluntary and community sector and council services, to look in the round at what was needed using a particular model called Ambit, which is, you know, again, links to how you offer good help. In terms of reach, that question about reach, going back to what I was saying in the presentation, the need to make sure that we have better connection with the groups on the ground that have the reach, and recognising that the council was not good at work. You know, there was more fragmented disconnect with some of those organisations. So that's been key in through the pandemic, and now it's about making sure that we actually embed that into the ongoing partnership work, so we don't lose that. Some of that is about changing the funding that is available to organisations, so changing the priorities that were reflected in the review of grants, the focus on organisations being able to put in grants based on their reach, and moving away from project-based delivery, which might exclude some of those groups. The points about metrics, I'm not sure, Councillor Patrick, it's worth me giving time going back over that now. I think I would say, once, you know, you have a look at, this was a taster, an opportunity to introduce what was going to be included in the framework, but happy to come back and talk about that more. In terms of your questions about employment and housing, that is why we've identified the need to influence employment and housing as specific drivers of poverty. So that's been, from the outset, important to do. And that brings me on to the question from Councillor Conway about whether we really are understanding all the hidden drivers of poverty, because I just wanted to assure Councillor Conway that when we first looked at this work, we looked at the evidence of the right approach to take. The Joseph Rowntree Foundation set out a very compelling approach, which is why we looked at both meeting the immediate material needs, but also looking at those drivers of poverty. And one of the drivers of poverty that they talked about was the influence of the state, and whether that was our council policies or benefit system. And so I wanted to assure you that that part of the framework, particularly the final area and the first area, the ways of working and the influence wider strategies, is about looking at where we might be doing something that is inadvertently pushing people into poverty. And it's the idea of how we can identify that with others and move to what, I mean, it's jargon, but what you could call more of a poverty-proofed policy in some of those areas. So I'd be interested in exploring that further, but I just wanted to assure you that we have tried to look at that full range of what's driving poverty, including what we might be doing.
Thank you very much, Sonia. That was really helpful. Now I've got a final round of questions, and if we're going shockingly over time, so if members could possibly keep their remarks as brief as possible, starting with Councillor Hayhurst, then Councillor Snell. Thank you.
Thanks, Chair. I just wonder whether it would benefit from being a bit more realistic and a bit more focused, you know, and a bit more honest. You know, there's a lot of things we're not going to be able to do. Social housing, cost of living pressures. The best we can do is probably stand still in an incredibly challenging environment. And without the action plan, I'm sort of lacking confidence to know how this is going to move forward. I mean, sort of Polly's sort of speculation, if I was in cabinet, I suppose if I was in cabinet, I'd want to just 10 specific areas whether it's sort of be Sophie's point about perverse incentives, making sure the council tax discretionary pot gets fully spent every year to those that need it, you know, and then work on those 10 for a year, and then the following year cabinet reevaluate another 10 challenges that fit to this, because it just seems it's too much. It's apple pie, it's everything we all believe in, but give me 10 concrete things we're going to achieve this year, and let's do that.
Thank you very much, Councillor Hayhurst. And Councillor Snell with final question.
This work obviously builds on what we were doing through COVID, which is frontline officers triaging, working where need was not immediately presented, and then passing people on. I was wondering whether we've managed to capture exactly which new clients were picked up through the process of supporting Hackney's population through COVID, from food banks, from other sources, by different service areas, and whether we could be both publicising those figures but also using them as a model for where in future we should be on the lookout for people who do need that extra support.
Thanks very much, Councillor Snell. That was admirably succinct. So, Sonia, for that last round.
Councillor Hayhurst's question about the specific action. So in the full framework, we are pinning down those areas and where we want to put our focus, and then linking that to, as I was saying, an action plan. And so some of those suggestions that you made are being addressed. But just specifically on the point about housing and employment, we're not saying that we're going to solve the housing crisis or develop all of the, tackle all the drivers of low wages that are there. So we're pointing to the employment and housing strategies and other strategies, and we're making sure that those strategies are looking at how you tackle poverty as much as possible. So I think they are realistic, and actually in the earlier drafts, there were probably versions that were too optimistic, and we've put in, as we've redrafted, we've made sure that that they're more measured, and critically that they've been developed by working with the services that lead on them, so they are, they're an honest, realistic assessment of what can be done. And in terms of Councillor Snell's question, it's an interesting one, because most of the people who've been supported have been supported in the community as opposed to being referred through to services. The point, I think, is more, how do we show that by supporting people at a community level who were not being supported before, and the council wasn't aware, what that teaches us about what works in that space. So it's not really data that we see in the council data, because people aren't coming through. And the work that's going on that I mentioned with an officer who's working closely with community partners, those are the sorts of questions we're asking, is, well, what can we learn about those who we're now better able to reach by more structured partnerships with the voluntary and community sector, including the very grassroots groups that go on, that aren't based on a grant for a year and a piecemeal approach. So they're not based on those transactional or contractual arrangements, they're based on ongoing partnership work.
Thank you very much for that presentation. I think we're going to have to leave it there, although I think we could easily discuss this all night. I think we're going to be picking up some of the points about housing in the mayor's question time. I think I just really want to conclude by reiterating that I think this should be an ongoing conversation with Scrutiny. I think we've got an ambition to continue feeding into this and challenging it. But I mean, thank you very much for bringing the framework and starting that conversation. Thank you. I think we're now going to move on to agenda item 5, which is the Mayor of Hackney's Cabinet question time. I don't know whether we're going to be moving around seats or something, so whether that's going to be helpful, because I'm having a bit of difficulty seeing the Mayor from where I'm sitting. So You're quite happy. Okay, I'll move. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, yeah. Just introducing this item. So a key element of our scrutiny function is to hold the Mayor and Cabinet to account. The Mayor's Cabinet question time is the responsibility of the Scrutiny Panel. We asked the Mayor to come and speak to us on 3 topic areas, which are going to be the focus of the questions this evening. We've asked Mayor of Hackney, and welcome to you this evening, to respond to the following questions. Firstly, to give us some information about what he feels are the most effective decarbonising policies and the reasons for his answer. Give us information about the biggest factors facing housing supply in Hackney, actions the council can take to increase supply and the impact of the pandemic on house prices and the cost and supply of materials. And thirdly, to give us some information about what he sees as the biggest challenges and opportunities for Hackney Council over the 4 years. So I'd like to welcome Mayor Philip Glanville. I'd like you to provide your initial response to the questions that Scrutiny Panel has sent over, and maybe if you try and speak to around up to 15 minutes. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. Do you want to do them separated out or the whole run through in 15 minutes?
Yes, I think that would be helpful if we separate them out. So yes, yeah, thank you.
Thank you. So I do just want, while it's fresh in everyone's minds, the topic that we've just discussed. I know it falls more into question 3, but I think it is quite useful to sort of pick up where Sonia left off. You know, I inherited in 2016 on becoming mayor the kind of the previous 2014 child poverty work, not active work taking place at the time, and wanted us to sort of refocus and be comfortable talking about poverty and interventions around poverty. And I think that political shift, now Sonia wasn't politicising herself by opening with the manifesto. I don't think without that manifesto commitment linked to our response to the pandemic, we would have a framework at all. I think we would not have that overarching approach. So there's something about a political willingness to get stuck in and to develop and support the kind of work that Sonia and Adrian have outlined. So I would say that doesn't happen by accident. Now, I think there are people in the organisation that wanted that approach and wanted to come forward and have a more coordinated approach to poverty, but we were able to unlock that through that political work. And I think that we have learned a huge amount about our response to poverty 2016 to 18, the conversations we had around things like the CCRS scheme, the sort of do no harm principles that I know Councillor Chapman and Councillor Renison led on in terms of our approach to corporate debt. I think there's a lot more to do, and I would really value your reflections as a scrutiny panel coming out of the discussion tonight while we're influencing developing the framework and heading towards Cabinet in March, because there is a month's worth of additional work as well as the detail that sort of Sonia highlighted, and I think it would be really valuable to have that insight feeding into the process. All of the Cabinet members that lead on this are here, obviously myself and the Chief Exec did hear that discussion. And I suppose, one easy method would be to task one Cabinet member with this work, and actually it is a cross-Cabinet work in the same way that it's cross-council, and each Cabinet member brings a significant part of their service and their experience to this agenda. And I hope that you will also see that reflected in the kind of action plan. When we come out the other side, there'll be clear accountability for Cabinet members around that. I also want to say about, of course, everything I'm saying tonight, this is no surrogate for the political policy development work that's happening within Hackney Labour Party in terms of the manifesto. And I don't want to stretch over into some of those discussions that are happening in another place, because I think it'd be inappropriate. I appreciate, this is the last question time of the administration. We're looking forward to the next 4 years. There's an election to get through. And obviously I can't speak for the manifesto that we're co-developing within the Labour Party this evening. In terms of the work around climate, and net zero, which was your sort of first set of questions. I know that SEG has been doing a lot of work around this already and has, you know, probed and I think challenged and spoken to officers as well as Councillor Cockburn. I know that other scrutiny commissions are also interested in this work, including Living in Hackney and others. And I hope what I say is sort of congruous with what Councillor Cockburn has updated on previously. Opening, you know, our approach set out originally in the manifesto updating the climate emergency was to very much get stuck into change and delivery and then come forward with a climate action plan at a later date. That was something that we sort of agreed as an administration collectively. It was also something that I think Councillor Burke, Councillor Cover's predecessor, was very committed to, is making sure that we did not wait and we did not waste years in developing strategies and plans when we could actually get into delivering change. So, you know, there are different approaches nationally to that dilemma. Some people obviously have published climate action plans already. We also said with our climate action plan that we wanted to go through that in public with ourselves, and Scrutiny has a role in that, but community-based organisations, the whole approach to a citizens' assembly and that piece of work. And I suppose what Councillor Coburn's outlined towards the climate action plan is to take that document in draft out to the public and give it scrutiny and airing before bringing it back in the next administration for final agreement, and then it will join the climate action plans that sort of London Council are supporting and curating. So that, in terms of sort of a strategic approach, I think that is the right one. Over the last 2 years, we've been working with consultants to map out our own emissions that we sort of control the sort of scope 1 and scope 2, obviously scope 3 emissions. I think in terms of the emissions that we directly control, we've made considerable progress in reducing our carbon emissions and net zero. You know, the whole borough since 2010 is 29% down. We've made the decisions around procurement, around fleet, around our energy usage. We've obviously done a huge amount of work to around the active transport and active travel piece. The direct question is, what do they consider to be most effective and why? I think the big prizes and the big impacts are still out there. They're consumption-based emissions. 71% of the borough's emissions are resident and business emissions. We have some influence on that. We have some legislative change from government coming on those areas, whether it be the Environment Bill, to Environment Act, and some of the work on waste and recycling and circular economy. There is quite, you know, food waste alone, huge contribution to emissions, but we only have part of that system. And you could have the very best waste and recycling system, but there is still upstream a huge amount of waste and carbon emission in the food system, of which we do not have direct control. So I suppose it's where we make our interventions and where we have the biggest impact. The area of retrofit and housing, I think it's been estimated 80% of London's housing stock and our public buildings and commercial premises will still be there in 2050. We clearly have a huge agenda to retrofit our council estate, our council's estates, and then influencing the wider borough, and precious little financial support in which to do that work. And at London Councils, we've been making the case collectively, and Hackney's been a leading light of that, of we need more investment in retrofit. We went to COP26, both as Hackney and London Councils, talking with the UK Cities Climate Investment Commission about the scale of the challenge. It's 98 billion across London and the core cities. And I would say that it's probably $1 billion in terms of our sort of housing stock, and a further $1 billion in Hackney around public buildings and housing associations and other things. You know, we are not going to be able to do that alone. We know the pressures that the HRA is under, we know the pressures the council is under in terms of funding. So we're looking at how we develop the financial models to deliver retrofit and get the ambition right for a net zero target that is currently 2040. There are really active discussions that I'm sure we're all aware of how we can move the council's emission target around net zero forward, and separating out that from the sort of borough target, which is at 2040. I think we can do more sooner. but there will still be the challenge, I think, around the council's housing stock. So we may well be able to move further and faster in ongoing discussions around that. I think when you compare that conversation you've just had about poverty and the cost of living crisis effectively, and that prize of retrofit, the biggest impact is around retrofit and having homes that are warm and affordable for our residents, but reduce the carbon emissions. But as I say, that is the highest cost ticket item, and the one that is least funded. I'm particularly proud, I think, though, of the work that we've done around the areas we do control, and I'll just sort of repeat those before opening up to questions. You know, switching to 100% renewable energy and doing that early. Our commitment around our LED lights and infrastructure, so you know, getting that to 100% LED in terms of our street lights, moving on to estates. I think the level of ambition that we've set around EV infrastructure, so there's 300 EV charging points or around there out in the borough at the moment. What we've sort of set out in terms of 3,000 EV charging points by 2030 is starting to shape the market, as well as set out a political ambition. So just transition, especially around the transport system, requires the infrastructure to allow that transition to take place. It means having infrastructure where people need to use it. It means there's an equity on that infrastructure, so it doesn't just chase current demand, the more affluent parts of the borough, that it gets ahead of it. It's on our estates, it's in those areas where there aren't currently EV vehicles, and it allows the people that work in our economy to bring home vehicles, for instance, including people that work for the council. You can sort of move forward piecemeal, or as I say, you can shape a market. And by saying we want those 3,000 EV charging points by 2030, the market has responded. We're involved in an active procurement, so I can't get into detail, but it's really, really clear that in terms of providers of that infrastructure and then funders of that infrastructure, the market took notice. If you just say, I'm looking for somebody to contract around 20 chargers in my current programme or 100 chargers in that current programme, you don't get the interest around the finance or around somebody stepping forward for that strategic partnership. And then some of the social dividends that you'd want to attach to that programme around you perhaps using our own energy that we generate from our estates, creating jobs and opportunities, all linked to sort of just transition. You don't get that if you don't make those big strategic steps. I think we've also looked at how we use our credits within the planning system to sort of recycle those into our work around the Greens Homes programme, for instance, which is going beyond what exists within government schemes to support our residents to make some of those transition choices themselves around the heating systems they use, insulation, solar as well. Obviously, Mayor of London programmes that we also support. So to finish, really comprehensive action now, developing the climate action plan that will set for what we do in the next administration and beyond, recognising the moment that we're in this decade. You know, we have to make the long-term decisions that will have an impact on whether we reach net zero in 2030 and 40, being more ambitious than the government, and making sure that we're really conscious of social justice and the jobs and skills dividend that we want for our borough as we make that transition. And happy to go into more detail through questions, Chair.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Mayor Glanville. So I can see one hand up. I'll start off with a question, and then I'll bring in Councillor Hayhurst, and then next round, Councillor Billington. I think Councillor Sharmani indicating. Okay. So first question for me. Thank you very much for that introduction. I mean, I think we, you know, as elected representatives, I think one thing we all understand is that residents in Hackney can be in very different places in the, you know, in relation to the issue of climate change. I mean, we do have residents who have, you know, are very, very engaged with the, you know, the catastrophic threats of climate change, and that's, you know, and they and that has made them make major changes in their own lifestyles, and, you know, and campaign passionately on this issue. But there are other residents in our community who aren't in exactly that place, who I think find it quite challenging to fit in the changes that are being demanded of them, or to increase their recycling or change their ways of transport. I think we all know the sort of issues we're talking about. I mean, how do we bring, you've touched on this a bit with the just transition, but how do we bring our entire community together? I'll also bring in Councillor Hayhurst as well for a second question to keep things moving.
Thanks, Chair. Mine's sort of quite specific. So in terms of the council's own sort of energy consumption and use, I think you said, Phil, that's 100% renewable, and I presume the vast majority of that is us buying from presumably one of the big six on a green tariff. So I'm just wondering now, with energy prices having increased so much, I don't know when our sort of bulk buy of energy comes to an end, but with essentially wholesale prices having doubled, the spend to save on solar is obviously, the payback is what, 2 years, 3 years now, much, much quicker. And so I know Ian's here as well. I mean, to what extent are we now thinking about capital funds for a mass investment in solar panels? Because presumably that makes commercial sense, as well as carbon sense.
If you'd like to take those two, Mayor Glanville.
Yeah, I think central to the question, it often plays out in the kind of response to some of the active travel measures. And I think what we've been really clear is there isn't just one thing we're doing to tackle climate change. This isn't about just a sort of crude assessment of we all want you to cycle more and we're not going to do anything else. That we know there are obstacles to recycling, there are obstacles to being, if you're not in control of the property that you live in, you cannot have, you don't have the purchase to change the carbon intensity of that home. It might be your landlord, in terms of social landlord, it may be a commercial landlord, and all of the work that you might want to do to educate people about energy use if they're living in a home with single glazing, you're still in fuel poverty. You're paying to heat the street. So I think, recognise in all the work that we're doing that there is an inextricable link to working with our communities and making sure that we are sort of recognising the grain of Hackney in that our diverse communities, that where our communities are at, what other tools and support. So Green Homes goes to working with people that may be renting their home, not just people that own their home, like some of the government schemes. The work that we've done around the introducing fortnightly waste collections had behaviour change and support locked into, and recognising that you couldn't just make that change overnight, that you had to work with people. And actually it wasn't about a sort of punitive sanctions regime, it was listening to our communities and making sure that they had the support to sort of make that transition. And I think that is our common approach to the sort of citizens' assembly model and the climate engagement that Councillor Coburn wants to lead in March. There is let's just have an event at the town hall and watch the usual suspects turn up, or an actual attempt to have a dialogue and discussion with a truly representative group from Hackney that may have divergent views on climate change. And I think where we've seen those sorts of models play out in other places, that dialogue within and between community is just as important as the strategies that the council set out, and what are the barriers and obstacles. And I think our approach to infrastructure and inclusive infrastructure is embedding social justice in terms of geography and reach in terms of the infrastructure that we're putting in place. So we're not just constantly doubling down the infrastructure that we have around areas where people are already taking up active travel, that they may already have EV vehicles, that have the best street trees already, that we're saying actually social justice, spatial justice is really important in that, and where we make those investments. And if we can lead that in places as well, that's really important. There is a challenge, just to sort of finish, around retrofit and some of the finance models of funding it and impact, that the biggest sort of dividend to help fund onward retrofit comes from retrofitting homes of more wealthy families, reducing their energy bills and capturing some of that to reinvest in further retrofit and fuel poverty reduction. If you invest in a home where people are struggling to heat it already, their energy bills tend to be lower than their richer next door neighbours who've just been, spending the money and heating the home, have more devices, and there's less dividend to capture to then reinvest in further retrofit. These are really big dilemmas that the council's thinking about, but all of those in the space around how you finance retrofit, how you unlock private investment. And so the instinct that we all might have is you make that investment just in those that are in immediate need and fuel poverty, but then you don't create that dividend that can be reused and recycled into further retrofit. And that is a bit of a challenge. What we have in Hackney, though, I think is some really good examples that I hope demonstrators and government will want to explore, is very diverse streets with these different energy, different households with different energy use, different levels of income and different experiences of fuel poverty and the cost of living crisis. So if you can capture the benefits in carbon reduction, but also harness some of that dividend, the sorts of streets that we have in Hackney are the sorts of places to do it, because we don't just have poverty and wealth concentrated in given areas. Our diversity is a bit of a strength on this agenda, but some of the tools don't exist. Polly will know probably more about the details, Councillor Billiton in her day job, than I do. But those are some of those challenges. I think Councillor Hayhurst's question, and I may defer to the latest position on procurement, because I know that Ian's been looking at how we address the pressures that the council's facing on our energy bill in terms of the charges that we pass on to tenants and leaseholders in our housing function. It insulates us somewhat in terms of being on a renewable tariff. Should be pointed out, it doesn't extend to gas. I think we've improved our biogas mix around gas, but the journey around renewable energy, the 100% is the electric bill, not the gas side. We're still very dependent on gas in our corporate buildings, in our housing estates, in our communal energy. Now, if you're sitting here in 2022, why didn't we exit gas? Why weren't we more ambitious on gas? But actually, when I started on this journey as Cabinet Member for Housing, we were still heating with oil. And the move to gas was seen as more efficient, cheaper, more reliable, and the decarbonisation benefits we got from exiting oil were quite substantial in the last decade, and my predecessors sort of captured that dividend and we got funding to do it. I think the kind of the draws on our capital and the question of whether solar now makes sense in the way that you've sort of set out, Councillor Hayes, I think we're still exploring. We still have to have the capital in the first place. We have set out a fairly clear ambition around a degree of municipal involvement in energy. Now, I think we're resetting a bit around working with Stoke Energy, taking the lessons of Bannister House and saying, we don't just want to do this alone. But I think when most of us think about that, we're thinking about cooperative models, community-owned energy, partnerships with the council, partnerships with the estate, drawing external funding. Camden's exploring a bond. We may well explore that sort of bond. If we go back to the lease roof model, which might get more capital flowing quicker into rolling out solar, we lose some of that control, but we might get a rollout faster. The Hackney Light and Power Board, I know, met this afternoon, and we're exploring some of those issues with Councillor Coburn. I don't think we've finally settled on that, but there's not an immediate burst into solar that we're able to sort of deliver, certainly this side of the election. Getting to 1 megawatt of production across our community buildings and our leisure estate has been the entire sort of focus of that team. And we will get there probably just after the election. Take stock of our lessons from that. If you look at, and perhaps we can provide the panel, the rates of return that we're seeing across some of those installations. It is really positive. It shows it's the right investment to make. Whether that entirely builds a business case to go as far as Councillor Hayhurst is sort of suggesting. I think that's the work that we want to do and is underway, sort of, and was underway today. I'm not sure if sort of Ian wants to sort of add to that in the sort of procurement space.
Thanks very much, Meg Glanville. We'll now have two more questions from Councillor Sharman and Councillor Billington in this round, then we'll move on to housing. If you could keep them brief.
You go first, yeah, okay.
Thanks, Phil. You'll be delighted to know that I'm not going to go into the detail of delivery on this, because obviously we could be for hours. I actually wanted to ask a sort of strategic question on governance within the council, because obviously if this is becoming central to the overall delivery and purpose of the organisation, how are we going to make sure that we are governing our net zero responsibilities properly across all of the services, including the issues to do with procurement, but commissioning services? Where and how do, for example, the services that we provide for our children and young people, how do we make sure that that is incorporated into our issues around governance? I know there are some plans for some restructuring to centre climate in the top team, but I'd be interested to know what thinking has been done in the council for making sure that there is governance which ensures that net zero is right at the heart of the decisions that we make.
Thank you, Chair. I'm just to welcome the Mayor's introduction that we're now looking for a plan for the decade, because I'm sure that's the right perspective to take on it. I just wanted to think about the necessary parts for a plan. And that is that we begin to know precisely what the contributions of each of the initiatives that you've discussed over the last will make, and over what time those will move us to the objective of a net zero. And this does clash with the way local governments finance on an annual basis, the 3-year planning perspective that we usually take, the 4-year political framework, but actually this is 10 years. And I think it's going to be important that the council has an outline through time of the resources necessary to achieve each of those. And I say that particularly because and it's a question how we're going to do this, because there will be a competition for resources. We heard earlier in this meeting from Sonia about changing the council's or focusing on poverty and the need to put money into that, making a major change in the way the council operates to do that. That's going to be a competition for resources. How are we going to see those wider objectives, those corporate overhanging objectives seen together? And how are we going to reconcile the pressure for resources? And just building on the point that Councillor Billington has just made, that will need to be managed, an accountability within the organisation and at its executive level. These are highly complex and they will draw on a number of professional inputs. Someone needs to be able to reconcile those competing professional demands, competing demands over services, and take a political decision about them. So you can certainly allocate someone to have an overview of it, but unless those people have real authority, the accountability for it will suffer. So I'm really taking an audit view, I think, of what are your plans, what are the resources committed to them, and what is the accountability for them.
Thank you, Councillor Shaw. I might start with your question and then come back to Councillor Billington's, if that's okay. Clearly, we have a new chief executive, we have a new structure coming, a new group director for climate, homes and economy. That is to provide some really clear focus around climate and sustainability. That is not to take anything away from the Sustainability Board, the way that Hackney Light and Power have been governed, the role that Ian and Rotimi and others in the council have played sort of thus far, because I think all of what I've listed and achieved has been delivered through that structure. But I think it's absolutely right, given the level of Hackney's ambition and the scale of the challenge, that we get more on the pitch. At the away day that we organised, the Chief Executive and I did quite a tour de force about saying why climate change and sustainability is everyone's business, and that every function of the council has a real role to play, and that the time is now past where you think somebody over there is doing it for you, or that person in Sonia's team coming from the corporate centre is holding the whole strategy and is somehow responsible. I think there's elements we all know within bureaucracies where that can play out, and Hackney can be as guilty of that sometimes as anyone, but giving that real sense that the new corporate leadership team, that new role together, are really responsible for this agenda. And I think that the governance that will come from that and what will sit beneath it, and I think there will be change beneath, I can't really second guess that now. I think we're going to continue with our existing structures until after the election, and then we'll reflect within a new CLT how we restructure around some of these priorities, and how we bring together people with a role to play in these disciplines. Because if you look at the way we do energy, there's parts of that in procurement, there's the central sort of energy team, there's housing services. They're all going to have a role to play on that sort of strand, but there's obviously much bigger strands, a much clearer focus around retrofit in housing services as well as corporate property. I think the role of your challenge as scrutiny here within the original commissions, and the role of audit, without breaking confidences of conversations I've had with both you and Councillor Billington, I think there's a crucial kind of role for audit around a sort of carbon audit, as well as how the finance stacks up and our journey to net zero. I think that's absolutely vital. Its core business is the constitutional change around governance that we need to see. Cabinet papers, procurement papers all have a reference to sustainability, but it isn't really written into the DNA of the governance of the organisation. I think we've got clear political leadership, but there's no one-stop shop for some of the other issues around green skills. They're going to be partnerships between cabinet members. There's obviously the work that and I suppose just linked to that and competing resources. I think we're really clear, because of the social justice element around climate change that I sort of answered in terms of Councillor Gordon, that some of these trade-offs are artificial. A failure to act will condemn Hackney residents to the worst aspects of extreme temperature, the worst aspects of air pollution. Will see themselves not skilled for the jobs that are coming. We'll see them not supported to retain the jobs that they have. There'll be the skills gaps and shortages in the council, and that will have an economic impact and a poverty impact further down the line. The failure to get to grips with how we heat our homes affordably will condemn Hackney residents to fuel poverty and long-term climate impact. So I think, we've got to look at everything we've discussed under poverty with a lens to climate and vice versa, and never live in a silo. And I'm really passionate about that around some of the infrastructure. It is very easy to say you've got money for trees and you're still putting up council tax, and that's putting me into financial difficulty. The choice is, if you don't make those long infrastructure investment, is urban heat island effect. The best time to plant a tree, glibly, is yesterday. These things do matter, and there are also universal public goods and the links to public health about some of our green infrastructure, and the work that Councillor Woodley is doing to kind of link that back to good life, that I think you need to sort of make when we're talking about these things. We've set out 26 million by up to 2023, 24, and I know the work to find some additional funding to kind of breathe life into that action plan is underway, and I think then we're tipping over into sort of manifesto process and sort of where we go next on that. But I'm really clear that we need that stronger governance. We need that real focus. It is a partnership effort. it is no one single part of the council that contributes to this agenda, and I hope that sense is sort of coming from mayor and chief executives. I think on Councillor Billington's question, could you repeat it? Sorry, I've argued my way off my sheet.
Yeah, very briefly, Councillor Billington. I think some of it's been covered.
It has partly. It's mostly about the overarching governance. So your reference to audit is important, the issues around accountability, but also the structures within the council, which will ensure that your assertion that net zero and climate change is everybody's business becomes a reality and isn't just a tick box on, yes, this is a sustainable policy. How are you going to make that a reality?
Glanville, if you could respond to that and then maybe move on to the next part of the agenda in relation to housing. Thank you, that's really helpful.
Yeah, forgive me. I think they were really linked, and in my original answer, probably don't have a huge amount more to add. I think there's something about climate literacy within the organisation as well, and making sure that is part of our sort of HROD work. I know Councillor Williams is really passionate about that. I know there's been some early work and thought, but I think that is part of it. And then the structures that I'm talking about. I do also want to get to a point where we're not making any wrong long-term decision in any part of the council around the journey to net zero. It's a bit like the work that Sonia sort of outlined, do no harm in terms of poverty. Or if we are, at the moment, I cannot guarantee that every part of the council, if it's about to do something in terms of its capital estate, is coming to that position with net zero in mind, or are they saying a roof has failed, a boiler's failed, we need to upgrade this system because it's coming to the end of the life. Partly that's a technological gap as well, that taking the next step to the next technology without some support. But I think we do want to very swiftly get to the point of, when you're looking at the capital update, it comes to every council meeting, that when you're seeing boiler upgrade at X primary school, or you're seeing us invest in our corporate estate, we're doing that with the very best of kind of net zero principles. And I think that's one example where we do need that sort of corporate government. We've got a very good sustainable procurement strategy, but at the moment it will probably lead us to the best gas boiler. We need to go beyond that quite swiftly and set out during the course of the next administration and the decade, when we install our last gas boiler in a residential home, in a corporate building, etc., etc. And I think that is the on-the-ground version of the higher level governance that I'm sort of answering yours and Councillor Sharman's question.
Thanks very much, Mayor Glanville. We'll see if you are now able to move on to our second question in relation to housing supply. And obviously, this links very much to the poverty strategy, because we've seen the staggering figures, the impact of housing costs on putting increased number of our residents in poverty. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Gordon. And I think in approaching this question, I might start with the stark reality of housing delivery. So and I heard Councillor Patrick's sort of question to Sonia. We all want to build more council housing. We all want to build more intermediate housing. We want the planning system to deliver more of those, as well as our own direct delivery. And we want to work in partnership with housing associations and others that want to deliver the genuinely affordable housing that our residents need. And we have set out on a journey to deliver our own housing delivery programme. It's set out in the manifesto. It rests on the Woodbury Down regeneration. It rests on the 2011 estate regeneration programme. It rests on the 2013-14 housing supply programme, leaseholder buybacks and the right to buy programme, the Mayor Housing Challenge, which is our partnership with housing associations to deliver more affordable housing. It relies on planning gain, and then some of the more innovative models that I know Housing Strategy continue to work on, such as co-living, self-build, and land trusts. But anyone building a home faces the challenges that I'm just going to talk about. Brexit, COVID, The cost of living crisis is very well understood. The pressures around inflation and construction, perhaps less so. So roof tiles are taking up to 36 weeks longer within our own direct delivery at the moment. The move away from render and facades that were discredited post-Grenfell mean that we were very much already in a place that we used bricks more than most housing developers. Well, now everyone has moved into bricks or brick slit facades, so the cost and demand around that is incredibly high. We are really focused on the quality of those bricks as well. That's partly a driver from planning. You know, anyone that's seen the expectations around design and finish there, but also our own aspirations to build very high quality council homes. And we've used bricks from, you know, Denmark, Belgium, Holland, Germany, and our own bricks here in the UK. All of those are having massive lead times and cost increases. Cement production dropped 11.4% in 2021. So there's a crisis around cement. There was a timber shortage that has implications from use of cross laminate timber and some of the carbon sequestration models. There was issues around those getting caught in ports, lack of lorry drivers, all of the things we were talking about last year nationally, real challenges around labour and the price of labour and the costs of that. Immigration system is obviously changing post Brexit, and while I think we do across most of our schemes have a good track record of continuing delivery during COVID, when you move over to some of our smaller housing schemes, they have taken longer than we would have wanted. We have several of our large schemes about to go on site that have planning permission: King's Crescent, Buckland and Wimborne, which are garage sites in Hoxton West, Marion Court. We are going back to our contractors and they're saying this is going to be 3 million, 4 million, 5 million more than something we'd only contracted last year. So if we're to go into the final contract signing for those to actually get them on site, we're seeing that level of increase. That is really hard for direct delivery, where we work very close to the margins anyway to ensure that we maximise the delivery of council housing and intermediate housing. So we obviously are a large organisation, but we are not a commercial property developer that necessarily has our own supply chain, and we have to, when we go on site, get best value for money for the taxpayer and to ensure that our schemes are viable. So there's some really significant construction and labour challenges, and we don't want to dilute our tenure mix. So, you know, we obviously have a planning MOU, we've gone to planning, but we've also got the political and values driven of maximising delivery of council housing. And we've got schemes that have planning permission that we want to get on site. So my view politically, and it's shared broadly amongst officers, is, you know, going back to re-engineer and redesign those schemes in the face of those cost increase pressures will delay those schemes going on site, with no certainty that actually, when we go back out to the market, we will actually get, given the levels of increase every time we go to the market, that we will get a more affordable contract price. So it is really, really, really hard to continue delivery and really hard to increase delivery in that context, even when you've got a really high-performing in-house housing team, the experience of delivery, the models that we've used to minimise our exposure to external commercial risks, such as Hackney sales, the way we finance development, the way we partner with our developer colleagues to get best price. All of the things I've talked about here before, we still face those headwinds, and I don't think they're unique to us. Having met with the GLA on Friday, it's consistent across the public sector delivering housing. So that's the sort of end question. So increasing supply has to be seen in that context. It is a bleak commercial environment that I want to inject even greater ambition through the next political process into delivering more council homes. But the struggle to deliver the ones we've already planned has to be understood in where we go next. I think there is, though, and I've been reflecting on this, there are ways where we can bring more of our land, more of our assets to bear in terms of delivering more genuinely affordable housing. And we've taken some good steps towards that. But I think the challenges of COVID, the challenges of the things that I've been talking about have probably slowed some of the speed at where I would have wanted to be if you'd asked me in 2018, where did I expect to be in 2022? But we have signed a member of understanding with TfL. So thinking about TfL sites in the borough where we've got joint land ownership. We've completed our asset review work. We're restructuring around capital delivery and corporate property to have a better and clearer, more coherent delivery function that will enable us to use the very best of experience that we've gleaned in a project like Britannia with our in-house experience. And I hope that, again, that will underpin the aspiration that we set out politically at the next election. The truths are, and I still believe them, that the only and most genuinely affordable home for a large swathe of our residents is a social rent home. The uncertainty in the private rented sector, the uncertainty around the middle market, we know that a social rent or a London affordable rent is what our residents need. Now, there is a middle, and I think it's really important that that intermediate middle is addressed. And that's why we have things like Hackney Living Rent and our shared ownership programme, and why we continue to campaign on private rented sector, Section 21, and all the things that Councillor Marima leads on both here and at the GLA. But you know, we still face a government that is not committed to fully regulating the private rented sector, all of the pressures that I've been talking about. And I think we're now starting to see house prices and rents, you know, I think the house price announcements today said, you know, the house prices continue to rise, especially in an area like Hackney, and private rents are now starting to catch up after a period of stability. And we know what they've done over the last decade. My view is we need to continue to be ambitious. We need to continue to intervene in that market, and that's why we have a direct delivery programme. And I do want to scale it, but I think there's just that note of caution. There is not a glib answer to the questions that you sent me this evening.
I mean, thank you very much, Mayor Glanville. I mean, obviously, I think we all welcome your commitment and acknowledgement of the, you know, absolutely essential nature of, you know, sustainable programme of social housing, you know, as meeting the needs of, you know, a huge amount of our residents. I don't think I can actually see any hands, and actually you've answered the questions I was going to come back with in relation to more support for people, for the portion of our residents who are going to be in private renting. So I think we may move on to the third question, just try and catch up with some more time, unless anyone's got any questions. Sorry, Councillor Potter.
Thank you for your feedback, Mayor, on, you know, the current housing programme where, you know, we're hopefully about to go on site. I mean, you've talked about all the difficulties. Do you think there are risks then still with the current programme in the way you've outlined?
Thanks, Councillor Potter. I think all the work that we're doing is to try and de-risk and get on site and meet the commitments and promises that we've made to our residents. So I talked about our programmes, and I started with the earliest and then moved forward to the late. I'm acutely aware of someone that has held the housing portfolio and been elected mayor now, you know, for over a decade in terms of this space, that I've sat in estate halls, as you have, Councillor Potter, in Kings Crescent, Woodbury Down, Colville, Nightingale and other places, and made promises to residents about their new homes. And meeting those promises and delivering those new homes has to be sort of mission one, as well as increasing the overall supply, because there is no financial route back to unpicking some of those regeneration schemes. And there is vacant land on somewhere like Kings Crescent that we need to get those new homes built to offer our residents. You know, I think I've been to this meeting before, or living in Hackney, and I used to say that the cost of a new council home was around £300,000 in terms of construction costs on our own land. That has now risen to 400, 450,000 over the time I've been coming as mayor to talk about these issues. That is an average. One beds are cheaper than 4 or 5 beds, and we do build 4 and 5 beds because of the need for family housing. Some of that is obviously investing in high quality materials, and you may be able to shave off some of that, and you know, the market clearly does that outside of Hackney. But the one thing that Hackney Council has that even some housing associations, we will end up managing these properties, and we'll probably end up reselling some of them if they're in shared ownership. So our interest in having a home that over its entire life is of higher quality with lower maintenance costs is actually quite important to us. And we were walking around King's Crescent picking up some of the challenges that residents have addressed us. But you know, I am really, really grateful that working with former Deputy Mayor Alcock in the early 2010s, we moved away from render and wood, and we decided we wanted facades built in brick, because it means we're now talking about panels on balconies, not entire facades when it comes to some of the post-Grenfell works. But those units were built at higher cost than their equivalents built by housing associations and others. So this is tricky, and every single generation building council homes has had that choice between quality and volume at a national level and in places like this. And I don't want to be the one that rushes headlong for kind of methods of construction that our successors live to regret. So I don't think there is a risk to being on site with King's Crescent very shortly indeed, or some of the other schemes that I'm talking about, or the published schemes that we are committed to. I think the greater risk is being able to credibly go back to you as elected members, to residents, and say what comes next while we're still working through some of those issues. But I know that we absolutely have to do that, both politically and for the future of housing supply in the borough. And I finish and recognise, as we've always said, that our own programme, without significant government support in a public housing programme across the country, cannot possibly meet all of the demand. You know, we are very proud of what we do. We've built over 1,000 homes. We've got 2,000 in the pipeline. The vast majority of those are social rent or shared ownership, but there's still a need for cost subsidy. There isn't an answer to where, you know, back to the 300,000 example, 100,000 grant or right to buy receipt, 100,000 capitalised rent, £100,000 cross subsidy. That ratio is now extended to the 450 figure. We can now spend 40% of right to buy receipts on it, up to I think 50 in some cases. That still doesn't answer the main financial dilemma about how you build that unit. But good news for King's Crescent shortly, I hope.
Thank you very much, Mayor Glanville. And obviously, Councillor Patrick spoke very passionately and eloquently on, you know, the challenge of this earlier as well, and the impact of that on our community as part of the poverty item. I'd now like you to move on to our third question, which is about the biggest challenges and opportunities for Hackney Council over the next 4 years. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Gordon. Well, we've done some of the challenges and opportunities, I think, in terms of the challenge around poverty, the current cost of living crisis, the headwinds that our residents face, and those that were there already. And I think one of the pieces of work that is really important, and I suppose why we refocused, is we no longer believe that just growth and in investing in, say, good schools would lift all boats. So a lot of our work, I think, is thinking about the challenge faced by the whole borough, the questions around jobs and skills and adult learning. I think that doesn't mean we're not proud of things like our education journey, but I think we have a longer look at the needs of our borough, especially around education and training. So biggest challenges: rebuilding trust post-cyber attack. I think it is really, really important that getting the basics right of your customer interactions as a resident or business with the council is not only fully restored, and it largely is for the first transaction if you're making a new one now, but there's obviously a backlog of people that have been trying to change circumstances in council tax, that have moved into the borough, that are updating their housing register. All of those interactions, we need to make sure that is as high quality and as accessible as it can be, and we need to ensure that that is the basis of trust that people have in us as a public authority. And I think that is absolutely crucial. And the extension of that is to high quality, value for money, universal services. And we've talked about some of those this evening, you know, waste, parks, our public realm, the quality of that public realm. And it is obviously within the living memory of all of us when Hackney failed that test at the dawn of the millennium. So that for me is absolutely crucial. I think in terms of opportunities and challenges, there's a dual link. We have learned so much about ourselves and the borough during the pandemic, and maybe it's something better to come out in questioning, but I think the lessons of how the council, adult social care, health and the voluntary sector work to support the most vulnerable. I think the work on poverty reduction that we've heard about, the partnership sense with the third sector and other public bodies, we're probably working together in ways that we didn't work even as closely when there was funding that funded partnership, if you see what I mean, at the when we had a strategic partnership. So I think that has identified all of those challenges that we talked about at the start of this meeting, but it really does give us opportunities to solve those things in ways that actually create a huge amount of renewed trust and doing with rather than doing to, and actually embedding that in the ways that we work in co-production, I think is something that we can really unleash, not tipping over into politics in the next administration. And there are really tangible examples, I think, of how we've pioneered co-production around change in this administration that will pay dividends for whatever comes next, whether that's the place-based conversations in Dalston, you know, a place that's gone through an immense amount of change. Councillor Snell knows it very well. We've chosen a side in Dalston, and that side is on behalf of the place and what that place means to local residents and businesses. And everything that we're doing is trying to shape our response there. Similar principles in Hackney Central. And that is a challenge, isn't it? The market wants to go in a certain direction. There are opportunities in that direction, but we want to shape that and achieve the dividend for local residents that we're so proud of. I think in Ageing Well and Young Futures, again, big conversations with our borough, lots of challenges come out of that, but then also solutions and ways to collaborate come out of that as well. And I think we're starting to see those dividends. You know, we no longer, hopefully, say we're going to modernise a park and don't co-produce that with our residents. So Shoreditch, built from the bottom up by local people with intergenerational principles kind of embedded. What we, you know, I think that gives us a huge set of dividends. We need and know that we need to do more around job skills and employment. I see Councillor Williams almost in my direct line of sight on screen. We've learned a huge amount from the programmes that we have run. We're an award-winning apprenticeship provider. We have done a huge amount of work on paid work experience and training. We've built new partnerships with the DWP around things like Kickstarter, but we also need to know, we need and know that we need to go further and faster on that. We've led on the living wage in our procurement. We've increased the number of living wage employers in the borough. We need to do more of that to have a truly inclusive local economy. So for me, it's the journey to net zero social justice, it's the poverty reduction work, it's the place-based regeneration and investment in housing, all built on sound financial management and high quality public services, at which we've been renowned, and there are challenges and opportunities in each and every one.
Thank you very much, Mayor Glanville. So I'll bring in Councillor Patrick and then Councillor Sharman. I can't see any other hands, and then Councillor Billing.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Mayor. You've outlined some of the really positive things and the challenges. Coming back to the challenges, what do you think the challenges are for the next administration of the government's levelling up that they wish to take on Hackney, and also for the aspect of change for local government? We haven't had a proper settlement from the government for a couple of years now, obviously down to COVID, so we don't know what our planning is for the future. This must sorry, this must make life difficult for us to plan for the next 4 years to implement all the good things, including the work on poverty reduction that we've just heard about. I wonder if you'd like to comment on that and how you think it might affect our residents.
Thanks, Chair. Just to, I think, respond to, I think, the inspiring range of challenges that you've set out. These corporate objectives are really ambitious and important for us. I guess the question comes back to the same as I've been trying to press throughout this session, which is that we need to have plans matched against resources for each of these, because there is going to be a real competition for resource. It's important that we don't make promises in these areas that we're not able to fulfill. And I guess what I'd like to invite you to do is to support Councillor Chapman's initiative with the finance department to try and set a framework, a resource framework for each of these corporate objectives, so that we can see through time how they are both realistic and compatible. And that's an initiative, I think, that's particularly important from an audit perspective of not over-promising. And I think the challenge will also keep coming back to this issue that you've rightly made a number of points, where many of these corporate objectives require many inputs across the council. And in each case, we will need not only to have, it's like an orchestra, you'll have different people in different areas, but what is crucial is that you have a score and a conductor in each of these. And my real worry at the moment is that in each of these corporate objectives, we need someone who is that conductor, who can really make sure that the players work together around these. But the primary, I think, call that Councillor Chapman's exercise will do, I hope, is to look for the way that resources need to be committed to each of these over time.
So I'll start with Councillor Patrick. I think I don't want to steal kind of Ian's quarterly finance update and some of the things that he might want to say in terms of resources, but I'm going to do an imperfect warm-up act to Ian, hopefully. And while we were sat here, we actually got the local government spending settlement on email, linked to all the charts. So, you know, that's the sort of dynamic nature of what is happening around local government finance. And it's really interesting, and forgive me, Chair, while Sonia was presenting, I was drawn to looking at that chart at the start of the meeting when I wasn't speaking, and the embedding of the concept of spending power, as if that is the end and the start of local government finance, that the government has been trying to embed in language all throughout austerity, is now the sort of only game in town. You have to click quite a long way through those spreadsheets to actually find the pots of money that we get, and not just a list of our spending power. Because if you look at spending power, allegedly it's going up 8.8 or 8.2%. I'm not going to go back to my laptop. That's barely half the story. Some of that will be made up by a council tax rise that we have yet to agree. Inflation erodes that spending power. And then actually, if you look at core grant, the services grant that was introduced just this year is currently only a one-off source of funding, and actually makes up between £7 and £8 million of that increase in spending power. So once you take that out and the council tax, the actual core funding increase is quite negligible, and a lot of the other things are small pots. You come back to levelling up. It's really easy to say, you know, don't level down London to level up the rest of the country. But the way all of that finance moves, and the movement back to one-off pots, and often quite politically focused one-off pots. I think it was Councillor Ema this week that tweeted that of all the current levelling up funding, we're receiving 16 pence a head. compared to constituencies outside London that are receiving, that are cabinet ministers that are receiving hundreds of pounds. Now, that is a useful way to look at levelling up funding. And if you did an analysis of spend per head on education, Hackney and Town Hamlets still have a higher percentage head, but then we have that higher level of need. And my fear is that you move to pots of funding that obfuscate and bait and switch away from core funding, and see sort of high street funds, transport infrastructure funds, levelling up funds that never answer the real questions. And all those missions that were set out in the levelling up white paper, there is no sense that any of them are going to be applied to London in focus. And there are so many parts of Hackney that we would note that need levelling up to the other parts of Hackney, never mind boroughs to our east that would need to be levelled up in terms of life expectancy, skills, jobs. You know, half the children in Hackney close to child poverty levels. So my biggest fear is that we will not see any answers to those big financial challenges in terms of the inputs to our budgets. That all of the funding will be levelling up related funding, if at all. And don't forget, the white paper's not funded itself. So, you know, and I think they were quite clear kind of on that in some of the critique. But, you know, fair funding remains. The services grant is a really difficult thing to now underpin our budget based on, because it arrived from nowhere, is 1 year, and we don't really know what the settlement looks like. It may have become 3 year in the course of this afternoon, and Ian can correct me. But and then that recovery NHS social care funding. You know, in theory, the government is going to fund the NHS to catch up with elective surgery, and at the end point, the national insurance will come back and start funding social care. Well, I don't think that will happen. For lots and lots of reasons, and the crisis in social care and prevention is now, not in 4 or 5 years' time, and it will, if we don't get it right, further fuel those cost pressure challenges in the NHS. So, quick canter through all of that, hopefully, and you may have a further response on corporate objectives. So, Councillor Chapman, myself, and others, I think we're really supportive of the policy-based budget approach that we're developing, and you've probably seen that in audit, and you may well see it in the forward budget process as the scrutiny chairs and vice chairs and audit together. I think that is where we will direct our investment around our corporate priorities, and obviously we're going to refresh those in the election, and it's absolutely, we're focused on funding those priorities and their impacts, and that we move away from a budget process that is just focused on kind of savings without recognising what the impacts of our investment will be. And I think you will start to see that around the transformation work we want to do around children and adult social care, but also other parts of the council, to make sure that we account for every pound that we're spending in those areas, and that we really look at impact and how the collective impacts of the council make a difference on the ground. And that is the only way, and I did raise your classic, Councillor Sharman, the other day, we don't just stop at the council, we need to get it right for the council, but your place-based spend, the whole public sector spend that you've talked about, you know, to me, to my predecessor, is absolutely right. And the integration work has to focus on that as well. And we can't allow it just to be an NHS acute hospital driven sort of spend discussion, which is how the government's really set us up with the national insurance. You know, it isn't around prevention, it isn't around social care, it isn't around local government. It is purely focused on a catch-up job, which is right. If you're waiting for elective surgery, I want the NHS to catch up. I want them to be funded to do it. But it's a bit like the dilemmas that Sonia talked about. We know there's immediate need, and then there's long-term need, and we need that funded as well. And that resource allocation is absolutely crucial to that job. And I think it comes back to the net zero discussion at the start.
Can I just follow up on a question in relation to the opportunities and also obviously the challenges that we explore in SEG broadly on the investment and the delivery of policies to support the economy more widely in Hackney? And again, our concern as a commission, that there seems to be a sort of assumption that the activities that we are conducting, or that the administration is conducting, the benefits of which are self-evident. And I would rather be confident, and I'd like to hear what you think about this, about what the evidence base is for that activity in terms of inclusive economy, and what good looks like as a result of that investment. Because absolutely speaking to this conversation we're having, if we don't have very much money, we need to spend every single penny of it wisely. How is that money, what evidence do we have that the investment that we are making in supporting the wider economy, and particularly businesses, and to make it inclusive, is doing what we want it to do?
Thank you very much, Mayor Glanville. And one final, actually, commission-based question from me. I mean, we've talked quite a lot this evening, really, I think, about our ambitions across, areas of policy in Hackney where we don't probably have, we can only influence and we can't really control it. But in relation to our children's, our children's upbringing and sort of early intervention and education, those are areas where the council's got quite a lot of powers, as well as really sort of important responsibilities. There are groups of children which we continue to let down, whether they're sort of excluded from school, or whether they come into our care as corporate parents, however much we try and make up for that. And there's obviously, there are certain children that are disproportionately affected there, and particularly black boys appear again and again in those groups, and we do continue to let them down. How can we bring them, front and centre in really, I think, into our ambitions, and how can we improve the services so that those things don't continue to happen, poor outcomes continue to happen?
Thank you both for those questions. I think the second question, Councillor Gordon, is probably going to be quite a long answer, which you might have to interrupt me on, because I care really passionately about it. On Councillor Billington's question, there's obviously two levers. There's three levers, actually. There's probably the place-based levers around the planning system and kind of the things we set our stall out in both our local plan and the spatial plans beneath that, and the SPDs. I would like to get to a point where we've got a greater sense of the impact of making the choices that we are around affordable workspace. How many jobs have been released? Who's got those jobs? And a bit more monitoring around that. I think we have obviously honed those policies, this administration, and tightened them, and I think stood by them in a way that has been really powerful. But I want to then say, we've done that. What is the impact of that in terms of jobs retained, created, Hackney residents into those jobs? And I think that counting is a lot harder to do, given the timescales between planning permission and the achievement of those social value dividends. I think what we've done, and I really thank Ian and Councillor Nicholson for this, is we've right-sized the team around our town centres and regeneration, around Suzanne's team and those people that work on the ground in our town centres and support regeneration and change, and they're partly going to work with planning around them, what next. You've created that space. There is that planning dividend. How do we animate it and how do we make it work for us? You do actually have to have people on the ground that are in there in those negotiations. The places where that's working best, probably somewhere like Hackney Wick, parts of Dalston, what's been achieved by the Hackney Wick plan, affordable workspace, and then getting the culture land trust to then operate that workspace. So the demand was, we want to retain affordable workspace and creative space in Hackney Wick. Planning said, yes, we've set out that structure in the Hackney Wick master plan, but then we actually want to get involved in running it and holding that dividend. And I think that is a good model, and that is more concrete. I think then you have to look at all of the work that Councillor Williams does on jobs and skills, and then linking that into the inclusive economy strategy and the town centre work. At the moment, we have an inclusive economy strategy, which I know you've been trying to an attempt to kind of hold us to account on in SEG. I don't think we have a clear action plan. I don't think we have the kind of KPIs and outputs that I know you want and I want. There are lots and lots of reasons for that. I think it's just for me to say, mea culpa, we will do better. And we need to work with you to set out what those could be, because we are not going to back away from intervening in the economy. I would finish on kind of, I think, where the insights in that team have added real value is we have lobbied very hard around a lot of the grants around COVID. And if you look at the successor to ARG grants, so what we actually have direct control of ourselves and where we've put that spend, we've put it against our sort of priorities. So it's obviously Omicron recovery grant, but thinking about the hospitality industry, thinking about Hackney's hospitality industry, all the things that Councillor Nicholson said at full council, but then there are future funds to come around green economy and transitioning to that economy. So we're starting to think about where can we deploy what funding we have around our corporate priorities and how they link to the economy. That is jammed tomorrow for SEG, I know, but I think that groundwork has started to be laid. And I think through what is ultimately repurposed government grant, we can get some signals where if we wanted to invest, where we go. Something like the cultural work, the dividend from SIL, the community funds that we've talked about, again, are a bit pathfinder in that. You know, what do they do on the ground to work with our communities around more inclusion and economic activity? And I think it's linking all that together. And I think, you know, the new structures we're putting in place will hopefully do that. But your critical challenge on that is absolutely vital, because I don't think we're there yet. And we don't just want a set of good intentions and publish plans. I think on Councillor Sharman's question, sorry, Councillor Gordon's question, we have work that has been sort of long predates me, like the young black men's work, that I think has rightly looked at a sort of long-term strategic approach, a lot of insight and co-production there. I think we've been less afraid to talk about these difficult topics. So if you look at everything we've said around education, skills, young people and intervention, we have been more comfortable being uncomfortable about these topics and how we respond to the external community challenge. So, you know, I think Councillor Bramble was absolutely passionate about reducing exclusions, the no need to exclusion agenda and work. That has now turned into concrete Year 7 projects. We have not seen exclusions in primary school for a number of years, the work around COVID, but it's very clear from the report of Children and Young People Scrutiny Commission and the work that Councillor Conway and yourself have done, that if you do exclude and find yourself an alternative provision, the support, the wraparound focus from the council as corporate parent and other agencies leaves a huge amount to be desired. And that is even with investment in some of that alternative provision. And it is absolutely sobering reading. I've spent a long time talking that through with Cabinet colleagues and Councillor Conway. We've got the serious case reviews that indicate the price of that failure, the societal cost of that failure, and we must respond to that challenge across the whole system as both corporate parent and a leader of an education system to do better. And that you know, it is all very well, and I'm very proud that we opened the new Regents College, but not all of those young people that we're talking about will end up there or should end up there. And we've got to make sure that all of that alternative provision is as high quality as it can be, as well as reducing those that go into it in the first place. We published last Monday a Future of Hackney Education document that I hope, if you read it in detail, we'll see all of these themes to come together as a sort of strategic reset for that working for every child that the Education Department has as its tagline. And that is inclusion around reducing exclusions and the diversity and demographics around that, but also thinking about SEND, in-borough SEND provision, the opportunities that come after that, and how we maintain a high quality education offer. And I think that is also vitally important in this space. And then I set my stall back out with what happens after school, 16, 18, whatever the leaving point of mainstream education, we then have to make sure that we have that offer through Hackney Opportunities to make sure job skills, career service, apprenticeships are all in place to close those gaps that may well have emerged during the education system. And so I think, you know, what we're doing on early years, what we're doing on early help, on family intervention, the family hubs model, how we're challenging the education system to be more inclusive, and then how we invest at the end as the council in, you know, what are not statutory services. You know, a lot of our jobs brokerage work, the work that we do around apprenticeships, the work of partnerships that we have with our community colleges, ultimately is value added, and it's got to justify itself. Back to Councillor Billington's point, you know, if we're going to use Section 106 in that way, if we're using our own resources in that way, what are the dividends? What value are we adding to that process, and also how we're monitoring equalities around that? So there has been a big focus in those programs on care leavers. There's been a big focus on ethnicity and gender in sectors where ethnicity and gender is not represented in the way. The commission around tech and the creative industries that Councillor Williams commissioned, you know, all of those things are sort of bound up in this territory. And I said it was going to be a very long answer, but I think those are all vitally important. But the thing that strikes me most about the Ofsted journey work and getting to outstanding, and the early conversations I've had with scrutiny chairs about what you want to do around care leavers, is making sure that we are the very best corporate parent, and that, you know, on housing and on jobs and skills, we act like a parent would. Because the reality of the economy that we live in is that middle class children in Hackney can fail, and their families and their cultural networks will pick them back up. And for the other half of Hackney's population, they won't benefit from that. And the council and all the public services that are here must give them the extra support they need to succeed. You know, people fail, but it shouldn't be the end point of what happens to the young people's in Hackney's life experience. And that can go around, you know, contact with the criminal justice system, you know, the differential impact of contact with the criminal justice system as a young black man versus a young middle-class white man who may have had the same contact with that criminal justice system, we know will be very different. We have to close that gap. And that's something that I know the whole administration is committed to doing.
Mayor Glanville, for those answers, and also for attending Scrutiny Panel this evening, and, you know, the wide range of subjects that you've answered questions on. I'm now going to move on. People may recall that we did promise a break, I think, a bit earlier. I think with the permission of the in-chamber and online attendees, I'm proposing to carry on if people are happy with that. And go on to the next item. Is there any dissent? Do you want to very quick? So I'm going to have a quick right now. Does look like it. So we're now moving on to agenda item 6, which is the quarterly finance update. And I'd like to welcome Ian Williams and Jackie Boylan, who are going to be presenting the update. We, as Scrutiny Panel, will regularly scrutinise the Council's budget reporting to allow non-exec members to retain oversight of the Council's overall budget. 2 reports are provided in the agenda. We've also asked for this finance update to include information about an outline of the local government finance settlement, which is, as we've heard, is a breaking area, information about the planned increase in fees and charges and impact, the impact of ongoing send pressures in the Council's budget, an outline of the pressures in the housing revenue and account, and an update on the backlog of rent and the impact of collection rates following COVID and the cyber attack. So thank you very much, Ian, for waiting so long and so patiently, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Chair, and good evening, everybody. Hope you're all keeping well. We've got a slideshow we're going to run through which will address all the points that the Chair's outlined. I would also just flag for people's attention who may not have clocked it already is that on Wednesday we're planning on holding a fees and charges drop-in session to be chaired by Councillor Lynch, and then on Thursday we're holding a full member drop-in on the budget as well. So a real week of finance updates if you're up for it. Okay. So quickly going to run through a few things this evening, but I also thought it would be helpful, Chair, to just update on the announcements made by the Chancellor towards the end of last week as well, if that's okay. And I'll be able to say as much as I can say on that in terms of what I know, and even sort of as we've been in this meeting, a bit more information on that's come out as well. So I'll try and go through this as quickly as possible and work on the basis that members have had a chance to read the 2 reports that were also circulated with the agenda this evening. The first of which covers the overall financial position, and as you can see, the forecast there that went to Cabinet in January indicates that on the general fund we're forecasting an overspend of just under £5 million. That's considerably down from what we were forecasting back in September, and probably when I updated Scrutiny Panel last at our October meeting, and that's been addressed in part by a range of measures that myself, the corporate management team, have implemented to further drive down any non-essential spend. Obviously, the last 3 months have been continually challenging with the Omicron outbreak, and that obviously required us to incur additional spend. But in the main, I'm really encouraged by the way that we've managed to stop the overspend increasing and actually look to bring it back into nearest into balance, and that's something which myself and Councillor Chapman have been working very closely with the Mayor and all Cabinet members on as well. Go on to set out some of the key points that were included in the OFP, and there's no real surprises there, is there, for anyone on this panel. The main areas of pressure for us related to adults and children's, and in particular some of the further work we've had to undertake to deal with the challenges posed by the cyber attack, of which I know we gave a detailed update at our last audit committee only a few weeks ago. Turning to the housing revenue account, again, the position there is as has been reported now for some months, continuing to see some real challenges on the housing revenue account, predominantly caused by challenges around income collection, and that's not just down to cyber, it's down to a whole range of things. And we've had some really good updates from Steve Waddington, our new Director of Housing, or reasonably new Director of Housing now. He's been with us a good few months. I know they've been well received, but we're also seeing pressures coming through in terms of people, and more people transitioning onto things like universal credit, as well as some of the challenges we'd experienced in addressing and identifying monies owed. Obviously, the DLO's had a challenging period, particularly in terms of its ability to generate income and work. But at the same time, of course, we continue to pay the wages. So I just think, again, that those pressures are ones which myself and Ajman have been looking closely at. But there's nothing in terms of the HRA update that will be a surprise to members of this panel. Turning to the arrears position, obviously, we've been monitoring for some time the increase in arrears, and the team are working hard to look to bring that into balance. I'm looking forward over the coming months really to continue to update members on the progress that Steve and the team are making in terms of recovering that position. Obviously, some of it will be addressed when we're able to make the changes necessary to the housing benefit calculations that will ultimately enable monies to be paid across once those reviews have taken place, but I'm confident that over the coming months we'll start to see the arrears position start to reduce, which is obviously a good thing for financial sustainability of the housing revenue account. Gone on there to summarise some of the management actions that are in play. So that's firstly completing the development of management by arrears, implementing what's called Rent Sense, and that's programmed to be implemented in April, and also then include more updated positions on the housing benefit impact. Also, the team have been working hard to embed a revised structure to income services that looks to make a more focused and targeted approach to income collection. So Steve and I have been discussing seeing the benefits of that coming through, and obviously we want to update not just audit committee but also this meeting in relation to that as well. Also really keen to see us move to that more proactive approach to income collection. Members will recall that as part of the HRA budget setting process, we established a team to provide additional support to residents who were in financial difficulty nearly 2 years ago, and really keen to make sure that work becomes really embedded and really starts to deliver for us. Turning to the capital update report, again, I think the Mayor's alluded to a number of things in this report already, but we saw in the paper that went to committee in January some really positive developments, particularly in terms of agreeing the new 10-year lease agreement with the Hackney Chinese Community Services Association at 12 to 14 Englefield Road, significant investment in the TfL funded schemes across a range of projects to reduce road traffic accidents, deliver our vision for zero and encourage sustainable transport within the borough as well. Turning to the local government finance settlement, obviously when we did these slides, they were the provisional settlement slides, and we had understood that the final settlement was going to be released on Wednesday. Certainly that was communication we'd had from the LGA, but I think on the back of pressure being applied to officials to just make the announcement as quickly as possible, particularly given that it would inevitably be a written statement, it was pleasing to see it be released, albeit in the last hour or so. We're still working through the fine details of it, but from my reading of the very quick headlines, it's broadly as we'd expected. It's pleasing that at last we've had the public health figures notified to us, so it was never clear why they couldn't have been announced as part of the provisional settlement. But just to very quickly build upon some of the comments that the Mayor said, and one of the things I can confirm is that it is still a one-year settlement, so there's no more indications of what funding the council will receive beyond 2022-23, which isn't, to be honest, a real surprise, given that, as I understand it, there's a significant number of consultations that now must be brought forwards if there's to be any changes to how council funding is distributed. But in very headline terms and at national level, what we saw is the increase in what's called core spending power for councils. And whilst it in a headline indicates an increase in core spending power, the reality of that is that the majority of it is either increases in council tax assumed, or actually just in some cases also includes increases in council tax base, of which, i.e. the number of properties we hold. The new one-off services grant, and just to build upon some of the comments the Mayor said there as well, is actually that money is only one-off, but actually is being badged as the resources to help to assist us in funding our contribution as the employer towards the increased national insurance contributions. So you'll recall, you'll have seen how employee national insurance contributions are due to rise on the 1st of April by 1.25 percentage points. Obviously that also feeds through to the employer, of which we are a significant employer of our own staff, and also to those who provide services to us as well. So we've been working hard as a team to make sure that we've are looking to align that to where it needs to go in terms of the council's overall budgets. Turning then to the other parts of the settlement, and I won't dwell on this too long, Chair, because I'm mindful that members of this panel will have had updates in other places on a lot of this. But again, we have had confirmation that the maximum increase that a council can raise council tax by is 1.99% for the pure council tax element, and a further 1% for what's been quite well known now as the adult social care precept, and that enables an ultimate rise of just under 3%. In terms of education funding, again, I know SEND is particularly a topic which this panel has focused on extensively over the years. Whilst we did see an uplift in our allocation for SEND high needs block of £4.8 million, latest modelling that I've been looking at with the team suggests that our increase for the forthcoming financial year will be nearer £7 million. And so we're having to look at ways to see how we address that in our overall budget setting, and look to how we manage that across the education budget as a whole. Turning then to the Chancellor's announcements late last week on energy costs, quite a lot of activity in this space. You'll have seen and no doubt read about. As I sort of sit here now, we haven't had any detailed guidance coming through in terms of, firstly, what our allocation would be as Hackney, and also what expectations there are on us in terms of what we include in our billing information. My understanding is that as part of the council tax bill, we will need to include a statement around what that £150 relates to. Some of the emails I've seen this evening suggest the Chancellor is looking at the fine print of exactly what it's going to require councils to include in their billing leaflets, but we are assured that the various legislative necessities will be laid before Parliament towards the end of this week, and as soon as I have that, I'll be able to update all members of this panel, and it might be even possible to do it at our session on Thursday evening as well. But in terms of what it means for Hackney households, our understanding is that all households in England in council tax bands A to D will receive a one-off payment of £150. It will operate outside of the council tax system, so it won't be something that we can automatically apply to people's bills. It will be a payment we will have to make to people. And the predominant way we'll need to do that is via the council tax lists that we hold for eligible households. Now, some members of the panel will be aware of the similar processes we had to go through very quickly when the business grant schemes were announced back at the start of the pandemic, and we'll recall that some of the challenges we had when we didn't hold the bank account details for businesses, and a lot of our businesses tend to pay directly as opposed to through direct debits, although we have been successful in moving a number of them onto it. So it will have some challenges, but I've been working with the team and with Councillor Chapman over the last few days to sort of think about tactics we could deploy to firstly boost the amount of information that we hold. As a very rough rule of thumb, about 50% of our council tax payers pay via direct debit, so we will hold that information. Obviously, you'll all know that within a borough like Hackney, we see churn, i.e. movement, be it from the private rented sector or all sectors, of around 20 to 25%. So obviously got to be mindful that some of that data will almost be out of date in terms of real time, but I would hope the majority of it will be there or thereabouts. And so looking at ways to try and increase take up and also make sure we get that money out the door as quickly as we can once we receive it. But also just a statistic that some councils may not be aware of, the way that the council tax banding system works in terms of which bands properties are in. Interestingly, 85%, circa 85% of accounts in Hackney are in bands A to D. So a very different position to say somewhere like a Westminster, which had a lot more higher bands. So it will see significant numbers of our residents receiving that money. That obviously, reinforces the scale of the challenge we're going to need to work towards. In addition, energy bills rebate and will provide around 28 million households nationally with an upfront discount on their bills their bills worth £200, and energy suppliers, I'm sure you've read in the papers, will apply that discount to domestic electricity customers from October, with the government meeting the costs. And as more information on that emerges, I'll obviously keep you all updated on that. Fees and charges. On Wednesday evening, Councillor Lynch is chairing our reconstituted one-off task and finish fees and charges working group. And you'll recall from previous years that as part of the annual budget process, probably the appendix, which on its own is almost the size of the rest of the papers going to the full council meeting, is our schedule of fees and charges, of which there's some very interesting ones at times in there as well. But these are formally approved, subject to any amendments by council as part of that budget setting process. For many years now, we've operated the themes, the priorities and principles of fees and charges. And the predominant charges fall into three categories, don't they? Those are set by statute, those are set by third parties and those which are set independently by sort of council services and departments, in which council's got full control. And the papers for the meeting on Wednesday have gone out with all the detailed schedules. So looking forward to taking more detailed questions there on those. We'll be certainly fielding the usual full team in terms of being able to answer all the necessary questions that come up. Just to remind people of some of the main principles and main points to note, that no increases are proposed. RE markets of storeholders continue to recover from the pandemic, so you'll not be surprised to hear that. And then most other charges increase either in line with CPI, unless they are set by other statutes. So you'd be familiar with things like parking and planning charges. We've got relatively few new charges this time, but predominantly they relate to new facilities that have opened. So a good example of that would be the Britannia Leisure Centre, where there are actually new services in terms of the offer that's provided there. So again, nothing out of the ordinary coming through. Turning very quickly then to the last sort of point you asked me to cover, Chair, which was the SEND pressures. I've touched upon some of the challenges we're facing there around an overall pressure of around £7 million that we're currently managing to offset, in part by some savings identified across the education budget. But we are seeing, coming through, particularly on the back of the pandemic, not insignificant increases in youngsters coming forwards requiring EHCPs. And we're looking to work closely with Jackie and her team and Annie to see how we can put in place further measures to mitigate some of that increase. And you'll have seen some of the measures that the Mayor's outlined in previous updates of the capital programme update report to actually invest in our own provision for SEND students, whereas currently they may be going to facilities that are out of borough at very high cost. So we are looking to see how we can bring in measures there. I think on that basis, Chair, I think the rest of the presentation pretty much as you've seen previously or are aware of, so I'm happy to pause for questions given the time.
Thank you very, very much, Ian, and thank you for providing those really detailed slides. And I'm sorry that you've had to canter through them in such a sort of, although you did it really helpfully. And I think, it's really helpful to see the detail. And when members come to questions, Ian has indicated that there's going to be other opportunities later in the week. So if we maybe just try and focus on the bigger picture issues this evening. I'll bring you in a minute, Councillor Snell. Obviously, there are a number of financial challenges for the council, and there's going to be, and we've been outlining in this meeting, I think, the huge ambitions we've really got to deliver on behalf of our communities. There are some very difficult questions and choices to be had here. I know that we are moving towards a policy led approach really in terms of future budget setting. It would be really helpful to hear a bit more about how that's going to be working, whether in relation to different policy areas and how that intersects with the cross-cutting policy challenges that we've been discussing this evening. And I don't know whether Councillor Chapman might want to come in on that as well. And I don't know whether just to see which other members have got questions. I don't know, Councillor Snell's got a question. Has anyone else got one? Or online? So, okay, I'll start with my question then, if we've only got two questions, and then I'll bring Councillor Snell in a minute. Thank you. I think Councillor Chapman wants to come in.
Well, just to say that in view of the lateness there, I won't say much, and I'll just refer you back to the Mayor's sort of excellent summary of the political context. Just in terms of the settlement, I would just to review the report that there's nothing in it that really changes any of the assumptions we discussed as we went through the discussions about setting the budget for next year and savings proposals, and I regret to say the outlook for future years looks as though we're still going to be in a sort of very tight financial situation.
Thank you very much, Councillor Chapman. Ian, did you want to come in on that as well?
I think, as Councillor Chapman set out, that's reflects the situation. The only thing I would add that continues to impact upon not necessarily Hackney Council and Hackney Council's finances, but will affect our residents and all Londoners is what was confirmed as part of the final announcement this evening was that the Mayor of London will be able to effectively increase the GLA precept by that £20, which is being talked about in terms of the amount being specifically targeted to cover the challenges in funding that TfL are experiencing. So that will see a significant increase in the GLA element of the council tax, subjects of the order of around £35, which proportionally is a significant increase when it's all brought together. So it's just to bear that in mind in terms of you know, the overall context of the settlement. Interestingly, it wasn't included in the core spending power figures.
Councillor Snell, and very last chance for any other colleagues. Councillor Patrick, did you?
Yes, both in the Chair's introduction and in your main report, Ian, there's a reference to the fact that some of the funding which is going into adult social care is in effect coming out of the local government departmental spending limit, which presumably means that although it's being badged up as adult social care funding, rather than us, as we're all having to do, fund adult social care because that's just taking over more and more of our budget, the government's doing that centrally and giving us less freedom of action. What are the implications that it's coming out of the local government spending pot and that it's not real new money?
I mean, I think in terms of the adult social care precept, then you're absolutely right. That's effectively almost by the back door, ring fencing resources that need to be spent on adult social care. We've now raised the adult social care levy for a number of years by the maximum since that flexibility was introduced a good few years ago now. I think the other aspect, though, I would draw attention to is the various monies that are now badged relating to whether it's adult social care or children's social care that we're receiving, and their relative temporary nature. We are in the cycle, aren't we, of 1 year's spending reviews and settlements. But a concern I've got is that the mechanisms underpinning the way that funding is calculated and then redistributed to boroughs is also going to be significantly reviewed as part of any update to the local government finance system. And Hackney, as you'll be aware, has benefited from the way that historically the formulas have been constructed from when the borough was a lot more deprived in terms of overall statistics than it is now, and its relative position, because I think everything in local government funding distribution comes down to how your relative position changes. So as an example, if we saw an increase in our population that was at a lower rate than everywhere else, then proportionally our share of the funding would drop, if that makes sense. So in terms of your point, particularly on adult social care, it's something which is really concerning me in terms of the sustainability of those income streams at the levels we've been used to, at the same time as which more and more of our resources get consumed, spent on ever fewer numbers of the population. You've heard me talk in other places about, broadly speaking, that something like 80% of our resources probably is spent on between 15 and 20% of the population. And that's obviously a challenge, isn't it, if it continues on that trajectory.
I mean, in terms of those calculations, the government, I mean, we've obviously earlier in the meeting heard that around a third of our residents after housing costs are living in poverty, and 48% of children are living in poverty. I mean, how do those calculations that are made in relation to government funding relate to those type of measures?
So certainly, in terms of the way that local government funding is distributed between different councils, a whole range of underpinning formula exist, which would look at, firstly, the big driver is population, so how many people live in the borough, but then it would look at sort of social economic factors. So it would look at things like deprivation statistics as an example, and that's why I come back to the point about how relatively your position changes compared to to other places is important. If you look at some of the seaside towns in the north of England, other parts of the country, what you'll see is our relative position compared to where we were 10, 15 years ago is a lot better it's a lot better now than it was then. And I think it's those interactions that we're going to need to be careful about in terms of understanding the impact on our funding, particularly if the size of the local government finance cake doesn't significantly change, which I can't see it doing in terms of increases, particularly with the state of the public finances. What Councillor Chapman and I have been discussing is once the consultations on local government finance are starting to be released, and they haven't been released yet, we'll be proposing to hold a series of sort of briefing stroke drop-in sessions with yourselves, with all councillors, to make sure there's a proper understanding and awareness of it. You saw the technical response that myself and the finance team submitted in regard to the provisional local government settlement, but also the letter that was signed by the Mayor and Councillor Chapman in terms of the more political response to the way the settlement was going as well. I think that was also published by the council probably around Christmas time from recollection.
Thanks very much. I'll now bring in Councillor Hayhurst.
Just briefly, it's very helpful sort of describing the relative point and how things might change going forward. Are you aware that might also impact upon the health distribution as well? Because I mean, in a similar situation, Hackney's benefited from a comparatively good health settlement, but is something afoot there that could change that going forward as well?
There has been, in terms of health funding, so this is money that the NHS effectively get, isn't it? That's your question specifically, Councillor Hayes. And yes, my understanding is that there's been a long-standing aim to effectively bring absolute funding levels more into line between inner and outer London. You'll have seen it, health and wellbeing, and no doubt other places, the relative amount of funding that the NHS spends on per capita in Hackney compared to, say, a Barking and Dagenham, a Waltham Forest or a Redbridge. And yes, certainly from when I've been in briefings with NHS officials or NHS London officials, that's the direction of travel they've articulated now for a number of years. Obviously, those changes haven't materialised at the speed they were originally anticipated, but I've got nothing to suggest that's not a direction of travel that we're not progressing in. But happy to do a more detailed update on that with colleagues from the NHS.
Thanks, Ian. That's very helpful. I mean, I know that both yourself and Councillor Chapman are working together with other treasurers and finance leads across London. I really hope you are going to be able to make the case that we really are, in a lot of our populations, are in desperate need of interventions by local authority, by local government, and that we have had to pare our services to the bone over 10 years of austerity, although we continue to try and innovate in Hackney as well, just to serve our communities as best we can. I'm not sure there are any further questions from me, and I think I'm probably going to close this item. Does anyone want to say anything else? Nope. So I'm trying to finish by 10. So moving on to agenda item 7, which is the minutes of the previous meeting. Are these agreed? Agreed. Thank you. Any matters arising? Yep. So, and agenda item 8 is the scrutiny work panel. Are there any comments on that at this stage? We're having one further meeting during the election period with the date to be fixed. And which will not be a public meeting. Agenda item 9, any other business? I thereby formally declare the meeting closed. Thank you very much, everybody. I know it's been a bit of a marathon.
Thanks, Chair.